The bright light hit his eyes so suddenly that Ethan Reed instinctively raised his hands to his face. A second ago, he had been running along the San Diego waterfront at dusk. A second ago, a podcast about last-mile logistics was playing in his headphones. A second ago, he was alive. Now he was standing barefoot on the cold marble floor of a hall the size of an aircraft hangar, surrounded by hundreds of people dressed in silk and velvet. A voice with no apparent source filled the entire space at once. It didn't sound loud. It sounded inside him. The voice said that each person present had been chosen for the 23rd trial of the rulers. The voice said that they had 5 gifts to choose from: grain, gold, blades, hands, or the cube. The young aristocrats were already rushing forward. One grabbed a bundle of swords and raised it above his head. Another clutched a chest of gold so greedily as if he feared it would be taken away. A third chose hands, and 20 armed fighters appeared out of thin air beside him. Ethan stood rooted to the spot. He didn't understand where he was. He didn't understand why he was wearing a stranger's doublet 2 sizes too big. He didn't understand why his legs no longer ached after his run. But he could clearly see that a matte gray cube the size of a fist was levitating in the far corner of the hall, and no one was approaching it. Absolutely no one. Ethan swallowed hard. His logistics-oriented mind spouted a short chain of reasoning. Everyone takes the obvious. The obvious means the understandable. The understandable means the limited. And everyone fears the incomprehensible. So it's either junk or a jackpot. He stepped toward the cube and said aloud that he wanted that one. The cube settled into his palm, warm and heavy. A voice announced that the choice had been made. The marble beneath his feet cracked. Light struck his eyes again. When Ethan blinked, he was standing on a hill. Below lay a village. 3 dozen houses, 1 mill, brown, barren fields. People stood at the foot of the hill, maybe 30, maybe 40. Men with pitchforks, women with children in their arms. Old men with that look on their faces that Ethan had seen hundreds of times at military bases when yet another inspector from headquarters would arrive. Weary resignation. The wind ruffled his doublet. The cube warmed his palm. Ethan looked at the village and began to count in his head. So that's how it is, Reed. You're dead. You're in a fantasy world. You're the baron of 200 men who will most likely be slaughtered in a month. You have no army, no money, no experience commanding living people, and judging by the faces down below, you don't even have the slightest bit of credibility. But you do have a pebble. A great starter kit, buddy. The cube in his palm twitched. An interface flashed before his eyes. Not a game interface. Not a magical one. Familiar to the point of toothache. Inventory reports. Operations log. Node status. The header read, Fort Base Yasin 7. Status, mothballed for 4,000 years. Operator not assigned. Assign current user. Ethan exhaled. For the first time since his death, he took a truly deep breath. Now that was something he knew how to read. He pressed yes. The interface unfolded like an operational summary. Yasin supplies. Energy, 0. Personnel, 0. Equipment, 0. Modules, 0. Everything at 0. A dead base. But the lines were alive. Each item had a cost in units that the interface called essence. Light infantryman, cost, 120 units. Build time, 24 hours. Field medical unit, cost, 300 units. Build time, 72 hours. A grain silo with a preservation circuit, cost, 500 units. Build time, 120 hours. Ethan eagerly scanned the lists. 7 years of logistics in a defense contractor had taught him one thing. No base starts with weapons. Every base starts with the question of where to get resources. He found the entry, Sources of Essence, and read it. Magically active ore. Sources of natural energy. Organic remains of wasteland creatures. And the last item stood alone, as if added later in a different handwriting. Emotional resonance of living beings within the operator's range. Ethan reread it. Emotional resonance. He didn't immediately understand what that meant, but the interface helpfully displayed a hint. Gratitude, trust, hope. Everything that living people direct toward the operator, whether consciously or not, is converted into essence. The conversion rate is extremely low, but stable. Ethan lowered the cube and looked at the village again. More than 30 pairs of eyes were looking up at him. No gratitude, no trust, no hope, only weariness. He began to walk down the hill. His doublet hung loosely on his shoulders. The boots weren't his own and were rubbing. Halfway down, a man came out to meet him. about 24 years old. His dark hair was tied back in a knot. His left leg dragged with every step. A short sword hung at his belt. His face bore the expression of a man too tired to be hostile, but not tired enough to be friendly. The man introduced himself. Captain of the Hazelford Guard, Daniel Cross. Ethan noted the surname. Cross, one of the 3 great houses. Daniel noticed how he tensed and immediately said that she has a distant branch. So distant, in fact, that she'd been exiled here. Ethan nodded. He knew this type, the kind of person sent to the very edge of the map so they wouldn't get in the way. Daniel asked, point blank, what kind of baron was he? Where had he come from? Which house was his? Ethan realized he didn't know the answer to any of these questions. He said he'd explain later and asked her to show him around the village. Daniel gave him a long look. Then she turned and limped ahead. Hazelford turned out to be worse than it had looked from the hill. The houses were barely standing. The mill creaked as if every turn might be its last. There was only one well for the whole village, and the water in it smelled of iron. Ethan walked and counted. He couldn't help but count. It was stronger than him. 31 houses. 4 of them were abandoned. 2 had no roofs. Livestock. 6 cows. 1 was limping. A dozen goats. There were chickens, but not many. Grain. He stopped at the barn. He opened the door. Inside, it was almost empty. 2 sacks, maybe 3. Yasenya's interface flashed and displayed the exact figure. Hazelford's grain supply, 412 kilograms. With the current population, that would last 26 days. 26 days. Ethan closed the barn door. Daniel stood nearby, watching him. She said the former baron had died 3 weeks ago. Fever. He was an old man and had barely gotten out of bed in his final year. The village lived on its own. Ethan asked if there was anyone in the village who knew how to heal. Danielle nodded and led him to a house on the edge of the village. A priestess healer named Sun Ari lived there. She was the only one in Hazelford who could read. A young woman opened the door. 26 years old, dark eyes. A calm face. Her hands were covered in herbal paste. Behind her, on a cot, a child of about 5 was coughing. Ari looked at Ethan, then at Daniel, then back at Ethan. She asked in an even voice, "Is this the new baron?" Daniel nodded. Ari wiped her hands on her apron and said that she currently had 3 sick children and 1 woman in labor, and if the new baron had come for taxes, he'd have to wait until spring. Ethan didn't answer. He was looking at the child behind her. Yasenya's interface displayed the data. Boy, age 4, lung inflammation. Without antibiotics, the prognosis is poor. Without antibiotics. Ethan closed the interface. He opened the module production menu. Field medical unit. Cost, 300 units of essence. In stock, 0. He clenched the cube in his hand and told Ari that he hadn't come for taxes. He said he needed to inspect every house in the village, every sick person, every leaky roof, every broken tool. Ari and Daniel exchanged glances. They clearly hadn't expected to hear this from the Baron. Ethan spent the rest of the day going from house to house. Yasenya's interface functioned as a scanner. He saw everything. The old man in the third house from the square had arthritis in his left knee. The widow on the outskirts had a roof leaking in 2 places, and her youngest daughter had been coughing for 2 weeks. The miller's millstone was broken, and he was propping it up by hand with a log. Ethan took notes, not in the interface, in his head. A logistician's habit. First, the big picture, then priorities, then a plan. By evening, he returned to the Baron's house. It was a 2-story stone building, the largest in the village, and the coldest. The hearth hadn't been stoked for a week. There was almost no furniture. The former Baron had apparently lived out his days here as if in a crypt. Ethan sat down on the only chair. He placed the cube on the table. He opened the interface and got to work. Essence supply. 14 units. Source unknown. Most likely residual energy from the area's magical background. 14 units. An infantryman costs 120. A medkit costs 300. A grain silo costs 500. He doesn't even have a tenth of what he needs for everything. Ethan leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. All right, Reed. The task is clear. 0 resources. Threats are unknown but guaranteed. People don't believe him. The base is empty. The only source of energy is the people who are looking at you right now as just another temporary failure. So the first step isn't soldiers, not walls, not weapons. The first step is to earn a single bowl of soup. There was a knock at the door. Ethan opened the door. Standing on the threshold was an old woman with a wrinkled face holding a clay bowl in her hands. Soup. Hot. The old woman said she was a village healer, that she'd seen the new Baron going from house to house all day, looking at sick children. That the previous Baron hadn't come down from the hill even once in 3 years. She set the bowl on the table and left without waiting for a reply. Yasenya's interface flashed. Essence, +1 unit. Source, emotional resonance. Type, gratitude. Ethan stared at that number. 15 units. Still 105 to go until the first infantryman. 285 to the medical unit. But this was the first unit earned not from the earth, from a human. He picked up the bowl. The stew was watery and almost tasteless, but hot. Ethan ate slowly. It was getting dark outside the window. The village of Hazelford was falling asleep. 200 people, 26 days' worth of grain. 1 lame captain, 1 priestess, 1 bowl, and 1 logistics officer with an empty base who, for the first time in both of his lives, was responsible not for cargo, but for living people. Ethan woke up from the cold. The hearth had gone out during the night, and the stone house had grown cold to the bone. He sat up in bed and opened the interface first thing. Essence, 15 units. Nothing had changed overnight. He got up and went outside. It was early morning. Fog lay over the fields. The mill was already creaking. Some of the peasants had been working since dawn. Ethan went down to the well. He drew some water. The water smelled of rust. He looked at the interface. Water purification module. Cost, 200 units. Unavailable. He drank this water because there was no other. The first thing Ethan did that morning was go to the granary. He stood there for 20 minutes, simply counting. 412 kilograms of grain. 197 residents, not counting the 3 breastfed infants. Consumption at the minimum ration is about 16 kilograms per day. 26 days. No, he recounted. 25. Yesterday, the miller had handed out the daily ration. Ethan stood there thinking. In his past life, when supplies ran out at the base, he'd call headquarters and a supply plane would arrive 48 hours later. There was no headquarters here. There were no supply planes. There was just him, an empty base, and 25 days. He went to look for Danielle. He found her on the outskirts of the village. She was sitting on a fallen log, sharpening her sword. Her leg was stretched out in front of her. Her left leg. That very one. Ethan sat down beside her. He asked what she knew about the neighboring domains. Daniel sharpened her sword and spoke. To the north lay Baron Grain's domain, small, about the same size as Hazelford. They traded grain for iron. To the east lay the lands of House Cross, vast, at least 5,000 fighters. Between Hazelford and the Cross holdings lay a mountain pass that made a direct attack unwise. But if House Cross wanted to come, they could simply bypass the pass in 3 days. To the west lay the wastelands, dead land. Monsters roamed there. Daniel described them briefly. Bad ones. To the south was a forest, and beyond it, 2 more small domains. Both were already paying tribute to House Cross. Ethan listened and mapped out the area in his head. Hazelford was in a dead end. The pass to the east, the wastelands to the west, the forest to the south. The only open route north to Baron Grain, who too could become a vassal of Cross at any moment. He asked Daniel when the tax collector had last come. She replied that it had been 3 months ago. The former Baron had given everything they asked for, half of the winter supply. That was why the village was now starving. Ethan felt his teeth clench. He asked when they would come again. Danielle said, usually once a season. So soon. Maybe in a week. Maybe in 2. Ethan stood up. He told Danielle he needed a complete list of the village's residents. Names, ages, what they do for a living, who's sick, who owns weapons. Danielle looked at him with an expression that said something like, "Are you serious?" Ethan said he was absolutely serious. Danielle limped off to do as he asked. While she was gathering the data, Ethan went to see Ari. The priestess was in her house. The child on the cot was coughing even worse than yesterday. Ethan sat down beside her. The interface displayed the data. High fever, labored breathing. The inflammation is progressing. He asked Ari what she was doing. She replied that she was applying compresses made of marsh grass. That was all she had. 3 years ago, there had been a healer with real medicine in the neighboring village, but that village had burned down. Ethan asked how many children she had lost over the past year. Ari fell silent. Then she said quietly, 4. Ethan stood up. He left the house. He stopped at the door and closed his eyes. 4 children. In his past life, he had never lost people. He'd lost cargo, containers, shipments, sometimes deadlines, but not children. He opened the interface. He stared at the line, Field Medical Kit, so intently it was as if he could lower the price with the power of his gaze. 300 units. He had 15. He switched to another section. Essence sources. Magically active ore. He went back to Daniel and asked if there were any mines in the area, or at least any outcrops. Daniel thought for a moment and said there was an old quarry in the wastelands, abandoned 30 years ago. They used to mine bluestone there. No one remembered what it was used for. Ethan asked how far away it was. Danielle said it was a half-day's journey. But this was the wastelands, and there were creatures there. Ethan looked at her, then at his hands, then at the cube in his pocket. He set off alone. Danielle called after him that it was madness, that she couldn't send a guard with him because she was the only guard. Ethan replied that that was exactly why she had to stay and guard the village. He walked through the fields for 2 hours. Then the fields and the gray earth began. The wasteland looked as if someone had burned all life out of the earth and forgotten to bring it back. No grass, no trees, only stone and ash. Yasenya's interface began displaying new data. Magical background levels elevated. Sources of scattered energy detected. The essence began to flow in. Slowly, 1 unit for every 30 minutes spent in the zone. Ethan walked and counted. 2 units per hour, 12 per day, 84 per week. At this rate, it would take 10 days to reach the infantryman. More than 3 weeks to reach the medical unit. Too long. A child with pneumonia wouldn't last that long. He found the quarry 3 hours later. A pit in the ground 10 meters deep. Blue stone glinted on the walls. The interface identified it instantly. Azurite. Magically active ore. A concentration of essence. High. 1 kilogram equals 40 units. Ethan felt his heart race. 40 units per kilogram. If he could gather at least 8 kilograms, that's 320 units. Enough for the medical unit. He climbed down into the quarry. The ore lay in layers. It crumbled easily. He stuffed the pockets of his tunic piece by piece. He worked with his hands because he had no tools. An hour later, his pockets were full. The interface displayed 3.5 kilograms collected, 140 units. Ethan wanted to gather more, but the interface flashed red. Warning, biological object, medium threat level, distance, 200 meters, approaching. Ethan froze. He was alone in a pit in the middle of the wastelands, unarmed, with his pockets stuffed with rocks. He scrambled out of the quarry quickly. Something was moving at the edge of the wastelands. Gray, about the size of a large dog, maybe 2, maybe 3. The interface showed 3 dots. Ethan ran. He ran across the gray earth, the stones clattering in his pockets. He ran and counted. 4 kilometers to the edge of the wasteland. The speed of these creatures was unknown. His own speed, in unfamiliar boots with pockets full of stones, was practically pitiful. He ran for 20 minutes. The creatures weren't chasing him. Maybe their territory had ended. Maybe they were full. Maybe he was just lucky. He ran out onto the fields of Hazelford, drenched in sweat, with trembling knees and pockets full of blue stone. Daniel met him at the edge of the fields, sword in hand. She looked at his face, then at his pockets. Then she said he was a complete idiot. Ethan agreed. He returned to the Baron's house. He laid the stones on the table. He opened the interface. Activate essence for more. Confirm. The stones glowed and dissolved. Essence. Plus 140 units. Total stock, 155. He still needed 145 more for the medkit. Ethan sat down in a chair. He couldn't wait for another trip to the quarry. The boy's cough was getting worse. He opened the production list and began began searching. Not a medical kit, something cheaper, something he could assemble right now. He found it, a field first aid kit, cost 60 units. The set includes broad-spectrum antibiotics, antipyretics, dressing materials, sterile. Ethan clicked produce. Assembly time, 6 hours. Essence cost, minus 60 units. Balance, 95. He waited 6 hours. He sat in the Baron's house and waited. When the first aid kit materialized on the table, he grabbed it and ran to Ari's house. Night. Ari wasn't asleep. She was sitting next to the boy, changing his compress. Ethan set the first aid kit on the table and opened it. Ari looked at the contents. White bandages, vials of liquid, instruments she'd never seen before. Ethan explained. This is an antibiotic. It kills the infection in the body. Give it 3 times a day. This is a fever reducer. It lowers the fever. Half a dose for a child. Ari listened, her hands trembling. She asked where it came from. Ethan said it was from his base. Ari asked what kind of base it was. Ethan paused. Then he said it was hard to explain, but he wasn't an enemy or a demon. He was just a man who had access to things this world had forgotten. Ari looked at him for a long time. Then she took the bottle and gave the child the medicine. By morning, the fever had begun to subside. The child stopped tossing and turning and fell into a normal sleep for the first time in a week. Ari sat next to him and cried silently, not out of grief, but because for the first time in 3 years, the medicine had worked. Yesenia's interface flashed. Essence, plus 12 units. Source, emotional resonance. Type, gratitude. Intensity, high. Ethan looked at that number. 12 units from one woman in a single night. A bowl of soup from the healer had yielded 1. The saved child had yielded 12. He was beginning to understand Yesen's economy. The deeper the problem you solve, the greater the return. Not because the system rewarded heroism, but because the gratitude of a person who was able to save a child for the first time carries more weight than gratitude for a hot dinner. Ethan left Ari's house at dawn. The village was waking up. There was already a line at the well. Someone was feeding the chickens. The mill creaked. He stood and watched. 107 units of essence. 13 units until the first infantryman. He could produce him today. 1 soldier in matte armor. Hazelford's first defender. Ethan opened the interface. The personnel tab. Light infantryman. Cost, 120 units. Not enough. 107 out of 120. 13 units short. He smirked. 13 units. 1 more child saved. Or 12 bowls of soup. Or 1 day in the quarry with the risk of being eaten. The infantryman appeared at dawn. Ethan stood in the Baron's house and watched as a man materialized out of thin air before him. First an outline, then flesh, then armor, matte, dark gray, no coats of arms, no decorations, functional. The soldier opened his eyes and looked at Ethan. Then he straightened up and gave a brief nod. Not a bow, not a salute, just an acknowledgement. I'm here, awaiting orders. Ethan looked at him and thought this was the strangest moment of his new life. He had just created a human being. This man had gray-green eyes, short, light hair, a scar on his chin that shouldn't have been there since he had just been born, but which was part of his program biography. The interface displayed the data. Private First Class, call sign, Ray, specialization, close combat and perimeter security, absolute loyalty to the operator. Ethan said good morning to him. Ray replied that it was a cool morning and asked where the mess hall was. Ethan almost laughed. The first soldier in his army, and the first question was about food. He said there was no mess hall. There's a granary with enough grain for 24 days. Ray listened and remarked that he'd seen worse. Ethan asked how he knew that. Ray shrugged and replied that he didn't know how he knew, but he knew for sure. Ethan led Ray through the village. The reaction was immediate. The villagers stopped and stared. A soldier in armor that no one had ever seen before walked beside the Baron. Calm, confident, armed with a short blade and a shield. Danielle was the first to see him. She approached. She looked Ray up and down, then from the bottom up, then at Ethan. She asked where he was from. Ethan said he was from his personal garrison. Danielle asked why she hadn't seen this man before. Ethan replied that he had arrived during the night. Danielle didn't believe him, but she didn't argue. She assessed Ray with a professional eye and said he moved like a trained fighter. Ethan nodded, because Ray was, in fact, a trained fighter. The only catch was that he'd been trained 4,000 years ago, or more precisely, 6 hours ago, according to the records of a database that was 4,000 years old. Ethan put Ray in an empty house next to the Barons. He gave him a task to patrol the village. During the day, the outer perimeter. At night, the inner perimeter. Report everything. Ray nodded and went to work. Simply, no questions, no complaints, as if patrolling a village of 27 houses were a normal combat mission. Ethan returned to the numbers. 227 units of essence. The medkit cost 300. He was 710-3. He could go back to the quarry, or he could wait. Essence, a token of the villagers' gratitude, was coming in slowly but steadily, 2 or 3 units a day. Not nearly enough. He decided to combine efforts. He sent 2 villagers to the quarry with a cart, instructing them to gather as much azurite as they could haul away. Ray went with them. Hazelford's first soldier's first combat mission, to guard the 2 men with the cart in the quarry. While they were away, Ethan turned his attention to something else. He sat down with Danielle and asked her to tell him everything about the House of Cross, everything she knew. Danielle spoke for 2 hours. The House of Cross was one of the 3 great houses of this trial. It was led by Victor Cross, 34 years old, winner of the last minor tournament, a strategist, not a madman, not a tyrant. Worse, an intelligent man convinced that the strong must rule the weak for the common good. His army numbered about 5,000 fighters. His domain controlled a third of the eastern coast. He systematically absorbed smaller baronies, not always by force but sometimes through offers, vassalage in exchange for protection. Those who refused disappeared. Daniel knew this firsthand because she was from the Cross family, a distant branch, the grandniece of someone from one of the collateral lines. She had been sent away to Hazelford at the age of 14 after one of her cousins broke her leg during training. It wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. Because she had beaten him in sparring and he couldn't accept it. The family sided with her cousin. Daniel was sent to the ends of the earth, officially as captain of the guard, but in reality as an exile. Ethan listened and took it all in. He asked how Victor reacted to those who refused to pay their tribute. Daniel replied simply, "First comes the tax collector, then the punitive squad, 10 armored guards. If that's not enough, 100 come. If even that's not enough, Victor comes himself. But it usually doesn't come to that." Ethan nodded, so the tax collector would come first, soon, and they needed to be ready. By evening, Ray returned with the peasants. The cart was full of azurite, almost 12 kilograms. Ray reported that there were traces of the creatures in the quarry, but they hadn't seen the creatures themselves. It's probably safer during the day. Ethan converted the ore, 480 units. Total stock, including the remaining amount, 707 units. His hands trembled. 700 units. That's enough for a medical unit, with some to spare. He immediately launched production. A field medical unit. Cost 300 units. Assembly time, 72 hours. 3 days. In 3 days, Hazelford will have a hospital. Remaining, 407 units. Enough for 3 more infantrymen, or for 1 infantryman and a grain silo. Ethan thought it over. The grain would run out in 23 days. He needed the infantrymen for defense. He needed the grain silo for survival. He needed both right now. He chose a compromise. 1 infantryman, 120 units, and a granary with a preservation circuit, 500 units. A total of 620. He had 407. He was short 213. 1 more trip to the quarry, maybe 2. He slept better that night, not because it was warmer, but because, for the first time since his arrival, he had a plan. On the 3rd day, the tax collector arrived. Ethan was standing by the Baron's house when he saw horsemen on the road, 6 armored soldiers. At the front was a man in an expensive cloak on a fine horse. Ethan opened the interface. Yasin reacted instantly. Scan. 6 fighters, moderate weaponry, 1 commander, name unknown. But there were documents in the commander's saddlebag. The interface read them directly through the leather of the bag. Ethan stood there reading other people's letters. An IOU in the name of a certain Horace Mail. A large sum. The creditor was a loan shark in the capital of the great house. A love letter from a woman named Lorna. A hotel address. A room number. And the most interesting part, a draft report on double-entry bookkeeping. The actual taxes collected from 3 baronies. And the amounts that Horace Mail had sent to the treasury of House Cross. The difference was substantial. The tax collector was stealing. Ethan pieced the information together in his head faster than it took the tax collector to ride to the square. Mail stopped his horse in front of the Baron's house. He looked Ethan over from head to toe. He noticed a doublet that didn't fit, a young face, no coat of arms, no retinue. Mail smirked and announced that he had come to collect the seasonal loyalty tax in favor of House Cross. The amount, 200 measures of grain. Ethan did the math in his head. 200 measures was roughly half of everything left in the granary. If they handed it over, the village would start starving in 12 days. The children come first. He looked Mail in the eye. Then he began to speak calmly. He said he knew about Mail's debt to the moneylender Berg in the capital. He named the amount. Mail turned pale. Ethan continued. He mentioned Lorna's name, the name of the inn, the room number. Mail turned as white as chalk. Ethan didn't stop. He listed the figures from the draft, the actual tax revenues from the 3 baronies, the amounts sent to the treasury, the difference. He said it all in an even voice, without a threat, without anger, like an auditor reading a report. Mail looked at him and said nothing. The armored guards behind him exchanged glances. They didn't understand what was happening, but they saw the look on their commander's face. Ethan smiled. Behind him, Ray emerged silently from around the corner of the Baron's house. A single infantryman in matte armor, his hand on the hilt of his blade. Ethan said they could classify this as a tax, or as an audit, and he asked which option would be more convenient. Mail remained silent for 10 seconds. The medical module materialized on the 4th morning after launch. Ethan chose a spot on the outskirts of the village, between Ari's house and the well. A white module the size of a small shed simply appeared out of thin air. The walls were smooth. The door had a soft glow around the edges. Inside, it was clean and sterile. There were 3 beds and a cabinet with medications, along with equipment that Ethan could identify only at the level of, "This is for diagnostics," and "This is for surgeries." Ari stood in the doorway, unable to enter. She stared at the white walls, the glass cabinets, and the flashing indicator lights, and didn't move. Ethan went in first. He took her by the hand and led her inside. He opened cabinet after cabinet and named the contents: antibiotics, painkillers, wound care supplies, wounds, surgical instruments, dressing supplies, a lung diagnostic machine, a blood purification machine. Ari stopped in front of a diagnostic machine. Her hands were shaking. She asked if this machine could be used to see inside a person. Ethan showed her how to turn it on. An image appeared on the screen. Ari held out her hand. Her bones and muscles were visible on the screen. She pulled her hand away. She held it out again. She pulled it away. Then she turned to Ethan and asked in a quiet voice, "My lord, if only I'd had this a year ago. Little Tessa. Her stomach had been hurting for 3 days. I gave her herbs. She died on the 4th day. If only I could have looked inside." She didn't finish. Ethan stood there in silence. He couldn't tell her that yes, that with this machine she would have seen the appendicitis, and that with the surgical instruments from the cabinet she could have saved the girl, because that would have been cruel. He said that now they had it, and that now everything would be different. Ari nodded. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and asked him to show her how each machine worked. They spent the whole day in the medical wing. Ethan explained what he knew. There was a lot he didn't know himself, but Yesenia's interface had built-in instructions for every device, detailed ones, step by step. Ari read quickly. She was the only one in the village who could read, and she absorbed the information eagerly. By evening, she had performed her first diagnostic exam on the boy they'd saved with antibiotics a week ago. His lungs were clear. The inflammation was gone. Ari stared at the screen, her face glowing so brightly that Ethan looked away. It was a private moment, between the woman who had been losing children for 3 years and the machine that had just shown her that this child would live. Over the next 3 days, the entire village passed through the medical unit. Ethan announced that every resident could get a checkup, free of charge, no strings attached. People approached cautiously. First came the mothers with their children, then the elderly, then the men pretending they didn't need it but going in anyway. Ari worked 16 hours a day. Ethan forbade her from working any longer. She didn't listen. He came in the evening of the 3rd day and found her asleep at the table, her head resting on an open instruction manual. He covered her with a blanket and left. The interface showed a steady influx of essence, 12 to 15 units a day. Gratitude, hope, relief. The village was changing, slowly but noticeably. People began greeting Ethan on the street, not bowing, just saying hello. Like to a person, not to a master. The old herbalist brought him some soup every evening. Now it contained more grains than water. On the 5th day, Ethan turned his attention to Danielle. He came to see her in the morning and said he wanted her to get checked out at the medical unit. Danielle refused. She said she was fine. Ethan looked at her leg, the left one, the one that dragged with every step, the one her cousin had broken 10 years ago. He said it wasn't a request, but an order from her commander. Danielle clenched her jaw, but obeyed. Ari ran the diagnostic. The joint was destroyed. A malunited fracture, chronic inflammation, partial muscle atrophy. Ari showed the image to Ethan. Ethan studied it for a long time. Then he opened the Yesenia interface and began searching. Not a miracle, a solution. He found it in the medical support, prosthetics and rehabilitation section. Knee joint implant. Cost, 150 units of essence. Requires a qualified surgical medic for installation. A qualified surgical medic. He had Ari. Talented, a quick learner, but she'd never performed surgery before. She needed a mentor. Ethan opened another thread. Commanders, archivists, medical staff. The list was long. Dozens of names. People who had served on Yasin 7 4,000 years ago. Doctors, surgeons, specialists, frozen in the archive, awaiting awakening. Cost to awaken an archivist commander, 800 units. To the accumulation ward. Ethan closed the interface. 800 units. He had 441. Even with the daily influx and trips to the quarry, that would take weeks of work. He decided to proceed in stages. First, the grain silo. The food situation was critical. 20 days. He sent 3 groups to the quarry over the next week. Ray guarded each one. The creatures were spotted twice, but they didn't come close. The presence of an armed fighter kept them at bay. The ore came pouring in. Ethan converted it and stockpiled it. By the 10th day in Hazelford, he had 930 units. He launched the grain silo, 500 units. Construction time, 120 hours, 5 days. At the same time, he activated a second infantryman, 120 units. The remainder, 310. The grain silo appeared on the 15th day of Ethan's stay in Hazelford. It stood next to the barn and was 5 times larger. Inside was a preservation field. Any grain placed inside it was stored without spoiling. No rot, no mice. Ethan moved all the supplies from the old barn. The interface showed the remaining grain, 280 kilograms, at the current consumption rate that would last 18 days. But now the grain didn't spoil, and that changed the math. Before, part of the supply was lost to spoilage, rot, mice, and dampness. Now every grain made it to the plate. The actual supply had increased by a third. Ethan stood in the grain storage and looked at the numbers. 24 days instead of 18. Better, but still not enough. He needed more grain, not from ore, but real grain grown in the fields. He went out into the fields. Hazelford's fields were barren, scant soil, poor drainage. The farmers plowed with wooden plows. Ethan didn't even bother to calculate the yield. The interface already showed it, critically low. He began to think. The ash base had modules for infrastructure, water treatment, a foundry, but what about agriculture? He opened the catalog and searched for a long time. He found it in the Garrison Support, Self-Sufficiency section. A soil enrichment module. Cost, 400 units. Effective radius, 2 kilometers. Increases fertility 3 to 4 times. 400 units. He had 310. Not enough. But he knew that in 5 days he'd have a second infantryman, 2 soldiers, 2 guards for the quarry, double the yield. He began to make plans. The second infantryman arrived on the 16th day. His name was Cal. His skin was darker than Ray's. He was quieter, calmer, specializing in reconnaissance and long-range combat. He had a short bow and a set of throwing knives. Ethan assigned him to the second patrol shift. Now Hazelford was guarded around the clock. 2 soldiers for a village of 27 houses. Ridiculous by any army's standards. But for a village that had lived for 10 years without a single defender besides a lame captain, it was like dawn after a long night. Daniel worked with both of them. She pushed them hard in training as if she were leading a company, not just 2 people. Ray and Cal took it in stride. They respected her, not because she was their commander, but because they saw how she moved, even with an injured leg, even while limping. Her technique was flawless. Her body remembered what she'd been taught since childhood at the Cross household. It was just that her leg wouldn't let her body do what it knew how to do. On the 17th day, Ethan sat down to do the calculations. The essence came from 3 sources. The quarry yielded an average of 200 units per trip, 2 trips a week, 400 units. The residents' gratitude yielded 15 to 20 units a day, 100 to 140 a week. The background harvest from the magical field yielded a pittance, 5 to 7 units a week. That totaled about 550 units a week. With that inflow, he could afford one infantryman every week and a half, or one large module a week. Or save up for an archivist commander and get him in 10 days. He chose the commander. Daniel needed surgery. Surgery required a surgeon. A surgeon cost 700 units. He had 310. He needed another 490, 9 days at the current rate. Ethan entered this into the interface as priority number 1. By the evening of the 17th day, everything had changed. People appeared on the road coming out of the forest. Not soldiers, families, women with children, old people, men with empty hands and empty eyes. 23 people. Refugees. Their village south of Hazelford had been burned down by a House Cross detachment 2 days earlier. They were heading north because someone had told them that in Hazelford there was a baron who didn't collect taxes. Ethan stood at the gate and watched them. 23 people. A woman with a baby. A man with a bandaged head and blood on his bandage. 2 children, about 6 years old, holding hands. An old man who could barely stand. The interface instantly displayed the data. Hazelford's food supply, 24 days at the current population, with the addition of 23 people, 21 days. Ethan didn't hesitate for a second. He told Daniel to open the gates. He told Ari to prepare the medical bay. He told Ray to help the wounded. The refugees entered Hazelford. A woman with a baby saw the grain silo and began to cry, not out of grief, but because it was full. A man with a head wound saw the medical bay and couldn't believe his eyes. Ari rebandaged his head. She treated the wound. She gave him painkillers. He sat on a cot and stared at the white walls. The children were fed. The old man was put to bed. Ethan stood off to the side and counted. 21 days. 3 days fewer than an hour ago. 23 new mouths to feed, but also 23 new people. 7 men of working age. One of them was a former carpenter. Yasenya's interface flashed. Essence, plus 48 units. Source, mass emotional resonance. Type, hope, relief, gratitude, intensity, high. 48 units, more than from the entire village in 3 days. People who had lost everything and found a place where they were accepted unconditionally generated essence with an intensity Ethan hadn't expected. He stood there, staring at that number, and he thought about how, in his past life at the supply base, every extra mouth to feed was a problem. But here, every person saved was a resource, not because Ethan was exploiting people, but because Yasenya's system was built on a simple idea. The more people who are grateful to you, the stronger you become. The stronger you become, the more people you can protect. A logistical cycle, closed loop, self-reinforcing. Ethan smiled, for the first time in 17 days, not out of joy, but because, for the first time, he saw a way forward. On the 21st day, Ethan woke the first commander archivist. 800 units of essence were consumed in an instant, and the supply was almost completely depleted. The remainder was 37 units, but it was worth it. A man in his 50s emerged from the Yasen 7 archive. Lean, wiry, his gray hair was cut short, the face of a man who had seen too many operating rooms and too few sunsets. Dr. Han So, major in the medical corps, specializing in field surgery and prosthetics. The last thing he remembered was the order to secure the base, then darkness, then light, and Ethan's face. Han So looked at Ethan for a long time. Then he looked around. Then he asked what year it was. Ethan answered. Han So was silent for a minute. Then he asked how much time had passed since the base was placed on standby. Ethan replied that it had been 4,000 years. Han So fell silent again, for a long time. Then he said that his wife would probably be upset that he was late. Ethan didn't immediately realize it was a joke, but he saw the hint of a smile on the old surgeon's face and understood. He led Han So around the village. He showed him the medical wing. Han So went inside, and his expression changed. He touched every piece of equipment. He opened every cabinet. He checked every instrument. Then he turned to Ethan and said the equipment was in working order, basic but functional. He asked who had worked here before him. Ethan brought Ari over. Han So looked at her, a young woman, not a doctor, a priestess, a healer, a self-taught woman who, in 2 weeks, had mastered the diagnostic machine and basic pharmacology using instructions from the interface. Han So asked her how many patients she had treated. Ari replied that she had treated 114 in 12 days. Hanso raised an eyebrow. Then he asked if there had been any fatalities. Ari replied that there hadn't been any. Hanso looked at Ethan and said he liked this woman. Ethan explained the situation. There's a captain of the guard, his knee joint is destroyed. She needs surgery, an implant from the Yesenia catalog. Hanso asked to see the patient. Ethan brought in Danielle. She entered the medical bay with a stony expression. She didn't trust this place. She didn't trust the equipment. She didn't trust the man who had appeared out of nowhere, just as Ray and Cal had. Hanso paid no attention to her mood. He sat her down on the examination bed. He examined her. He studied the x-rays in silence. Then he said that the joint needed to be completely replaced, that the surgery would take 4 hours, that recovery would take 3 weeks if the patient followed instructions, and that if the patient didn't follow instructions, he would personally tie her to the bed. Daniel looked at him with the same expression she used when looking at everyone, a cold, appraising gaze. Hanso held her gaze without blinking. He'd seen far more terrifying stares. 4,000 years ago, Ethan had launched production of the implant, 150 units. He had 37. He needed another 113, 3 or 4 days at the current rate. He made the most of those days. Hanso began training Ari. It was brutal. The old surgeon made no allowances for the fact that his student was a self-taught girl from a medieval village. He demanded precision, speed, cleanliness. Ari gritted her teeth and worked. She made mistakes and tried again, made mistakes and tried again. Hanso yelled at her once. Then he watched her apply a suture to the training mannequin and fell silent. A minute later, he said the stitch was acceptable. For Hanso, that was the highest praise. On the 24th day, Ethan was talking to the refugees. A carpenter from a southern village named Tom Raines turned out to be more valuable than Ethan had expected. He wasn't just good at building, he knew how to organize a construction project. Ethan put him in charge of restoring 4 abandoned houses for the refugees. Tom gathered 6 volunteers and got to work. Within 3 days, 2 houses were under roof. 2 other men among the refugees turned out to be former farmers. Ethan gave them a plot of land by the river and seeds from the Yesenia catalog. The seeds cost only 20 units of essence, but they were fast-growth seeds. The harvest would come in 6 weeks instead of the usual 4 months. The village began to grow, not physically but energetically. People started moving faster, talking louder, and laughing. Ethan heard a woman from among the refugees singing one evening as she washed clothes by the river. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard singing in Hazelford. The interface showed a steady increase in essence, 20 to 25 units a day, fueled by the residents' gratitude and hope, plus the quarry twice a week. By the 25th day, he had enough for the implants. On the 26th day, Hanso performed the surgery. 4 hours. Ari assisted. Ethan waited outside. He couldn't watch. Not out of weakness. It was because, before the surgery, Daniel had looked at him, and for the first time in all the time he'd known her, there was no coldness in her eyes. There was fear. Not fear of pain, fear of hope. She was afraid it would work. Because if it worked, that meant 10 years of pain hadn't been necessary. It meant things could have been different, and that was more terrifying than any pain. Hanso came out 4 hours later. He wiped his hands. He said the implant had settled in well, that the joint would work, that she would need 3 weeks of recovery, and that he'd already warned the patient about the ropes. Ari came out later. She was pale and her hands were shaking, but there was a new fire in her eyes. She'd assisted in a real surgery. She'd held the instruments. She'd helped make the incision and suture the wound. She'd seen a damaged joint replaced with a new one. She saw the future of her profession, and that future was dazzling. The 3 weeks of recovery were hell for Danielle. She hated lying down. She hated waiting. She hated depending on anyone. Hanso came every day. He changed her bandages. He checked the implant. He made her do exercises. Small ones at first. Wiggle your toes. Bend your foot. Then more serious ones. Lift your leg. Bend your knee. Hold it. Danielle did everything with the expression of someone walking across a burning bridge, silently, gritting her teeth, without a single complaint. In the second week, she bent her knee all the way for the first time. No pain, no click, no familiar grinding that had accompanied her every movement for 10 years. She bent her leg and froze. Then she bent it again, and again. Ari stood nearby, smiling. Hanso stood by the wall, nodding with the air of a master who knows the job has been done well. Danielle looked up at Ethan. He was standing in the doorway of the medical wing. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were wet. For the first time, On the 20th day of her recovery, Han So allowed her to stand. On the 21st, to walk. On the 22nd, Daniel left the medical wing and walked down the village street, steadily, without limping. Without a limp. Without pain. People stopped and stared. Many had seen her limping her whole life. All 10 years she'd been here. And now she was walking straight. On the 23rd day, she walked out of the village, into the field. Ethan saw it from the window of the Baron's house. She stood at the edge of the field. Then she started to run. Not fast, not graceful, hesitantly, like someone who had forgotten how to run and was now trying to remember. She ran about 30 meters and stopped. She stood there for a moment. Then she ran back, faster, more confidently. She ran across the field for 20 minutes. Then she returned to the village. She found Ethan. He was sitting on the steps of the Baron's house. She walked over and sat down next to him. They sat in silence. A minute. 2. 5. Danielle didn't say thank you. She didn't bow. She didn't swear her loyalty. She simply sat next to him on the steps. And for her, that meant more than any words. Yesenia's interface flashed quietly. Essence, plus 26 units. Source, emotional resonance, singular. Type, trust. Not gratitude, not hope. Trust. Ethan looked at that number and thought that trust was worth more than gratitude, in units of essence and in every other unit he knew. Meanwhile, the world outside Hazelford hadn't stood still. On the 28th day, Ray reported that he'd seen horsemen heading North Road. 3 of them. Reconnaissance. They didn't come close. They watched from a hill and left. On the 30th day, Cal discovered the tracks of yet another observer, on foot, hiding in the woods south of the village. He left before Cal got close. Someone was watching Hazelford. Ethan knew who. House Cross. The collector, male, returned and reported. A baron who doesn't pay, a soldier in strange armor, a hospital that appeared out of nowhere, a grain silo, refugees. House Cross had considered Hazelford a minor thorn before. Now he was rethinking things. Ethan sat at his interface that evening, making plans. At that moment, he had 4 fighters. Ray, Cal, Daniel, recovered and stronger than ever, and a 3rd infantryman he'd promoted while Daniel was recovering. His name was Mori. His specialty was siege engineering and fortifications. 4 fighters against a village that had grown to 220 people. Against the House of Cross with its thousands. Ethan looked at the numbers and knew the first strike would come soon. Not a full army, a punitive detachment. 10 to 15 armored soldiers, enough to burn down an ordinary village. Not enough to take a fortified position if the village even had any fortifications. He called Mori over, told him they had 2 weeks at most. They needed walls. They needed positions. They needed a defense plan. Mori looked at the village. He looked at the terrain. He looked at the resources. Then he said he wouldn't be able to build walls. But he didn't need walls. He needed moats. False passages, blocked approaches, stakes. He wouldn't build a fortress. He would turn the approaches to the village into a maze where 10 men could hold off hundreds. Ethan smiled. The engineer spoke his language. Not superiority in strength, superiority in structure. Work began the next day. Mori was in command. The villagers dug. Tom Raines, a carpenter among the refugees, built wooden structures. Daniel trained the militia. 12 men from the village and among the refugees volunteered. Not fighters, farmers, bricklayers, 1 shepherd. But Daniel didn't need fighters. She needed people who knew how to stand in formation and do as they were told. She put them through their paces for 4 hours every day. Formation, shield, spear, hold the line. Don't run, don't run, don't run. Ethan watched and counted. He was always counting. 4 professional fighters, 12 militiamen, engineering barriers, a medical unit in the rear with Ari and Kanso, against 10 to 15 House Cross plate armored soldiers. The math was on the edge. And Ethan knew that in his line of work, math on the edge meant prepare for the worst. He launched the production of 2 more infantry units, 240 units. Then he opened the equipment catalog. He found what he was looking for. Reinforced field barricade. Cost, 80 units. 10 of them, 800 units. He did the math. He didn't have enough. He chose 5 barricades, 400 units, plus 2 infantry units, 240, 640. He could afford it if he sent groups to the quarry every day for the next 10 days. Risky. The wastelands were dangerous. The creatures were becoming more numerous. But he had no choice. He sat in the Baron's house and wrote a plan. Tables, supply schedules, deployment of forces, retreat routes, civilian evacuation plans, coordinates of assembly points, routine work, painfully familiar. Only in his past life, behind every line were containers. And now, behind every line were people. Names: Martha from the outskirts, Tom Rhines with his 3 children, the old man among the refugees who thanked him every morning for the porridge. The House Cross punitive squad arrived on the 39th day. Not 10 knights as Ethan had expected, 15, on horseback, in heavy armor bearing the crest of crossed blades on a red field. The commander rode at the front, young, about 25, a self-assured bearing, an expensive cloak. Cal was the first to see them. He was on watch on the southern hill and sent a signal an hour before they approached. Ethan was standing in the Baron's house, poring over a map. Mori entered and reported. 15 horsemen, heading along the southern road. They'll be at the village in 40 minutes. Ethan nodded. He'd been expecting this. 10 days of preparation. The trenches had been dug. The stakes were in place. The decoys were ready. 5 barricades from Yasin's catalog stood at key points. 2 new infantrymen, the 4th and 5th, had taken their positions. Ethan opened the interface. 6 of Yasin's fighters, Ray, Cal, Mori, and 3 new recruits, plus Daniel, plus 12 militiamen. 19 men against 15 heavy cavalrymen. On paper, it was almost a stalemate. In practice, heavy cavalry in an open field would crush the militiamen in 3 minutes. But there was no open field. There was a maze. Mori had scouted every approach to the village. The southern road, the only route for cavalry, narrowed between 2 ditches to a width of 3 men's widths. Then came a bend. Beyond the bend was a barricade. Bypassing the barricade led to a false passage that ended in stakes and yet another ditch. The only real path into the village led through a narrow corridor between the houses where cavalry lost all its advantages. Ethan gave the orders. Ray and 2 infantrymen at the barricade, Cal on the hill with a bow, Mori in the second line, Daniel with the militiamen in the corridor, Ari in the medical unit. Hanso was right beside her. The civilians were in the granary. It was the most secure module. The walls of the ash tree withstood the impact better than any stone. Ethan took up a position on the roof of the Baron's house. The interface displayed the entire battlefield. Every point, every fighter, every enemy, like an operational map at a command post. Only instead of a battalion, he had 19 men. And instead of a headquarters, the roof of a 2-story house in a village at the edge of the world. Cross's squad approached the southern line. The commander saw the trenches and stopped. He hadn't expected fortifications. A village of 27 houses doesn't build trenches. A village of 27 houses hides or flees. The commander sent 2 men out on reconnaissance. They circled the perimeter, they returned, they reported. Trenches on 3 sides, stakes, barricades made of an unfamiliar material. Soldiers in matte armor manned the positions. The commander thought for 3 minutes, then he made a decision. They dismounted. 15 heavily armored warriors set out on foot along the southern road. Through a narrow passage between the trenches. Just as Ethan had expected, Cal struck the first blow. An arrow from the hill. It struck the lead warrior squarely in the gap in his armor. He fell. The rest raised their shields. A second arrow. A third. Cal shot quickly and accurately. Yasen's training. 4,000 years of military experience condensed into a single fighter. 2 armored warriors fell within the first minute. The commander bellowed and drove the rest forward. They ran through the narrow passage toward the barricade. Ray waited. When the first armored warrior reached the barricade, Ray stepped out from behind it, alone, calm, blade and shield. He met the first armored warrior with a shield blow to the chest. The man flew backward. Ray finished off the second with his blade. Clean, quickly, without any unnecessary movements. Yasin's armor was lighter than it looked. Yasin's blade cut through this world's steel like a hot knife through butter. A 4,000-year gap in technology. It wasn't a fair fight. Ethan knew it. He watched from the roof and knew. 3 armored soldiers attacked Ray at once. He retreated behind the barricade. They scrambled over it. 2 infantrymen were waiting on the other side. The corridor behind the barricade had become a trap. It was cramped. Heavy armor hinders movement. Yasenya's light fighters maneuver freely. 5 plate-armored soldiers were taken down in 3 minutes. The squad commander realized he'd fallen into an ambush and gave the signal to retreat. The remaining 8 turned around and ran back down the passage. Daniel and the militiamen emerged from flanking positions to meet them. 12 men formed a wall, spears forward, shields closed. Not an elite unit, farmers who'd been trained for 3 weeks to maintain formation. But in the narrow passage, formation was everything. The armored soldiers crashed into the wall of spears. 2 fell immediately. 3 tried to break through the shields. Daniel stepped forward and met the one closest to her. She moved differently, not like a lame captain, like a fighter who had been taught to kill since she was 14 and who hadn't been able to use that skill to its full potential for 10 years. Now she could. Her sword was fast, precise, efficient, not a single wasted movement. 1 soldier fell. The second recoiled. The third dropped his weapon. The battle was over in 12 minutes. Ethan timed it. 12 minutes. 15 heavy cavalrymen of House Cross. The result, 9 killed. 4 wounded and surrendered. 2 fled. The commander surrendered. Hazelford's losses: 2 militiamen wounded, 1 seriously, a laceration to the shoulder. Ray took a blow to the side. His armor held, but a rib cracked. Ari and Hanso received the wounded in the medical bay 4 minutes after the battle ended. The militiaman with the shoulder injury was on the operating table 6 minutes later. Hanso sutured the wound calmly and methodically. Ari treated Ray herself. A cracked rib, immobilization, painkillers, 2 days of bed rest. Ray said he was fine. Ari said she didn't care what he thought. Ethan came down from the roof. His legs wouldn't hold him up. Not because of his wounds, because he'd spent 12 minutes watching people kill each other. He'd seen death for the first time. Not in reports, not in news briefs, in person. A man who, just a second ago, had been running and breathing now lay on the ground, motionless. Ethan made his way to the Baron's house. He sat down on the steps. His hands were shaking. He clenched them into fists and held them that way until they stopped. Then he stood up and walked over to the prisoners. The squad commander was sitting on the ground without his helmet. A young face, fair-haired, frightened. Ethan crouched down in front of him. He asked his name. The commander identified himself as Lorenz Weiss, 2nd Lieutenant Dom Cross. Ethan asked what he had been ordered to do. Lorenz replied, "Burn down the granary, execute the Baron, drive off the livestock, disperse the population. Standard procedure for a rebellious barony." Ethan listened and something inside him turned to stone. Execute the Baron, standard procedure. He asked Lorenz how many such missions he had carried out. Lorenz was silent. Then he said 3. Ethan stood up. He looked at the 4 prisoners, all young, all under 25, soldiers following orders. He could have executed them. Under the laws of this world, he had every right to do so. Invaders on his land, killers sent to kill him. He could have, but he didn't. After defeating the punitive squad, Hazelford was granted 3 weeks of peace. Ethan knew this wasn't peace. It was a pause while House Cross decided what to do with the village that had defeated 15 plate-armored soldiers. He made the most of every day. The soil enrichment module was deployed on the 42nd day, 400 units of essence. The effect became apparent a week later. The soil, which for years had yielded only meager crops, began to change. The farmers were the first to notice it. The color of the soil grew darker, richer. The accelerated growth seeds from Yassen's catalog sprouted so quickly that old farmer Heinrich spent 3 days walking around and touching the sprouts, unable to believe his eyes. Ethan stood at the edge of the field and did the math. At the current yield and with the enrichment module, the first harvest would be ready in 5 weeks. The yield would be enough to feed 300 people for 4 months. If they planted a second crop immediately after the harvest, they'd be set for the winter. For the first time since his arrival, the food crisis had dropped from the top spot on his list of priorities to second place. The House of Cross now held the top spot. On the 45th day, the second wave of refugees arrived. 41 people, 2 families from the barony of Grain, which had finally fallen under pressure from Cross, 3 more families from the eastern villages, and a group of 11 people who did not identify themselves or explain where they came from. Among them was a girl, 19 years old, thin, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that darted quickly, taking in everything around her. She was carrying a boy of about 5 in her arms. She introduced herself as Sua and said she was a peasant from an eastern village, that her village had been burned down, that the boy was her younger brother. Ethan looked at her and at the interface at the same time. The interface displayed information about the documents in her bag. Letters, a map, the Kim family's ancestral seal, a small house destroyed by the House of Vulcan 2 months ago. The girl wasn't a peasant. She was an heiress, Kim Ji-yoon. Ethan said nothing. He ordered that she and her brother be given a house, food, and a spot in the grain storage line. Ji-yoon accepted the job in silence. She didn't say thank you. She didn't bow. She didn't cry. She took the sack of grain and began measuring out the rations. Precisely, carefully, not a gram more, not a gram less. Ethan watched from around the corner. The girl counted faster than some of his colleagues in San Diego. In 3 days, Yine mastered the distribution system and silently revamped it. She didn't ask any questions. She simply noticed that rations were being distributed per person without taking age or health into account. A child doesn't need as much as a grown man. A nursing mother needs more than an elderly. She recalculated and proposed a new table. Ethan found this table on the grain storage table that evening, on the 3rd day. He stood there reading the numbers. Then he reread them. Then he sat down on a sack of grain and stared at the paper. The table was perfect. Allocation coefficients by category. Children's ration, adult rations, increased rations for the sick, reserves. Everything he himself had planned to do the following week, she had done it in 3 days. On the 48th day, Ethan summoned Yin to his office. She came with her brother because she never left him alone for a minute. The boy sat in the corner and silently drew on the floor with a stick. Ethan told Yin that he knew who she was. Yin froze. Her hand rested on the knife at her belt. Quickly, instinctively, the hand of someone accustomed to defending herself. Ethan said she didn't need the knife. That he'd seen the Kim family crest among her belongings at the Kim residence. That he didn't care which family she came from or who she was running from. That she didn't need to hide in Hazelford. Jian stood there and looked at him. For a long time. Her hand slowly let go of the knife. She asked what he wanted from her. Ethan placed her grain distribution chart on the table. He said he needed someone who could do the math like that, not like a peasant, but like a manager. He offered her the position of head of supplies, full access to the stockpiles, responsibility for every gram of grain and every ration in Hazelford. Jean listened without blinking. Then she asked why he trusted her. She'd only been there 3 days. He didn't know her. Ethan replied that he knew her spreadsheet, and that was enough. Jean was silent for 10 seconds. Then she nodded and went back to work. On the 50th day, something happened that Ethan hadn't planned for. A creature appeared on Hazelford's western border, coming from the wastelands. Not a small one, not like the ones that used to run around the quarry. A large one, the size of a horse, gray fur, 6 limbs, a mouth with 3 rows of teeth. Yesenia's interface classified it. Class B object, single target, large caliber, critical threat to the civilian population. Ethan read the classification and smiled to himself. Large caliber. In his past life, that's what they called things that shoot. Here, that's what they called things that eat. The creature emerged from the wastelands at dawn and was heading toward the village. Cal spotted it from his lookout post and sounded the alarm. Ethan assessed the situation in a minute. 6 fighters against a single Class B creature. According to Yesen, a Class B creature requires at least 4 trained fighters to neutralize it. He had 6, plus Daniel. Enough. But he didn't want to take any chances. He sent Ray, Cal, and 2 infantrymen. Daniel was eager to go. Ethan forbade it. She needed to cover the village in case the creature wasn't alone. Daniel gritted her teeth, but obeyed. The fight with the creature lasted 20 minutes. Ray took the brunt of it. His shield withstood the first blow. The second, the third dented it, and Ray was sent flying 5 meters. Cal drove 4 arrows into its side. The creature turned toward him. 2 infantrymen struck from the flanks. Yasin's blades pierced its hide, but not deeply. The creature was resilient. It roared so loudly that children in the village began to cry. Ray got to his feet. He tossed aside his shattered shield. He gripped his blade with both hands. He approached from behind while the was fighting the 2 infantrymen and drove his blade into the base of its skull. The creature collapsed. It twitched. Then it went still. Ray sat down next to the corpse and said, "It's been worse." That was his favorite phrase. Ethan arrived 10 minutes later. He looked at the creature, then at the interface. Organic remains of a wasteland creature. Essence, content, 240 units. He hadn't expected that number. 240 units from a single corpse. That's more than 2 trips to the quarry. He gave the command to convert. The essence poured into the reserve. Ethan stood over the carcass and thought. The wastelands were a threat, but they were also a resource. Every creature that came to die at the walls of Hazelford brought with it energy for its defense. Grim arithmetic, but arithmetic. On the 52nd day, Danielle came to Ethan with a report. House Cross's reconnaissance had intensified. Now observers were on duty constantly. 2 on the southern hill, 1 in the forest. They weren't hiding. They wanted to be seen. A message. We know where you are. We're watching. We're coming. Ethan took the news calmly. He'd expected this. The released captives had passed on the information. The village that had defeated the punitive squad. Strange armor, strange weapons, a hospital, a grain silo. House Cross was reassessing the threat, and the next move would be more serious. Not 10 warriors, not 15, 100, maybe 200. Ethan opened the interface and began to tally what he counted best: time, resources, people. He needed more fighters, more modules, more essence, and he needed an ally, someone outside Hazelford, someone House Cross hadn't had time to swallow up yet. He summoned Cal. He set the task: reconnaissance to the north and south, find the surviving baronies, small houses that were still holding out, isolated villages, anyone who needed help and was willing to help in return. Cal nodded and set out at dawn. Ethan watched him disappear into the morning mist, a single scout in a land roamed by the armies of the great houses and the beasts of the wastes. A thin thread stretched into the darkness, the only hope that Hazelford would not be left alone. Cal returned 6 days later, thin, dirty, with a torn sleeve and a fresh scratch across his cheek. He reported clearly. In the north, 2 small baronies were still holding out. The barony of Thorn, about 150 souls. The baron is old and sick. They're surviving on last year's supplies. The barony of Meld, 200 souls. The baroness is young. She fights every day against small bands of marauders from ravaged domains. The south is desolate. All the villages south of the forest have either been burned or have sworn allegiance to House Cross. To the west lie the wastelands. The creatures have grown in number. Cal saw a pack of 7 Class C creatures, small but fast. They were moving eastward, toward the people. To the east lies House Cross. It is building up its forces. Cal got close enough to see the camp. 200 fighters, siege engines, a supply train. They were preparing. Cal listened and recorded the information in the interface. 200 fighters, siege engines. It was a camp. 200 fighters, siege weapons, a supply train. They were preparing. Ethan listened and typed the information into the interface. 200 fighters, siege weapons. This wasn't a punitive expedition. It was an army, small but real, against his 9 Yesenia fighters and 12 militiamen. He thanked Cal and sent him to the medical bay to see Ari. Then he sat down at the table and began to think. 200 fighters. Even with Mori's engineering barriers and the Yesenia's technological superiority, it was too many. The fortifications that 15 wouldn't hold off 200. He needed walls. He needed long-range weapons. He needed more people. And he needed time, which he didn't have. Ethan opened Yesenia's catalog. He searched for a long time. He found it in the Defensive Modules section. Border Shield. Cost, 800 units. Radius, 300 meters. The shield blocks physical objects moving with hostile intent. Ethan reread it. With hostile intent. The magic of this world operated on strange principles. A stone thrown at a wall would pass through. A stone thrown with the intent to kill would not pass through. An arrow from a hunter aiming at a deer would pass through. An arrow from an archer aiming at a defender would not pass through. A perfect defense. 800 units. He had 460. He needed another 340. At the current rate, that would take 5 or 6 days. If he ramped up extraction from the quarry and got lucky with the wasteland creatures, then 3 or 4 days. According to Cal, Cross's army hadn't moved yet. They were preparing. The supply train was being assembled. Maybe a week. Maybe 10 days. Maybe that would be enough. Ethan started a mental countdown and got to work. On the 59th day, he set out for the barony of Thorn, in person. He took Ray with him. It was a 2-day journey north along the road through the forest. The barony of Thorn looked just like Hazelford had a month ago. Barren fields, sick people, an empty granary. Baron Thorn was lying in bed, an old man of about 70, running a fever. His granddaughter was sitting beside him, a girl of about 12 with serious eyes. Ethan asked permission to examine the Baron. The granddaughter nodded. The interface displayed the data. An infection, advanced. Without antibiotics, death within a week. Ethan took a field first aid kit out of his bag, the second one he'd made. He'd brought it along specifically for this. He gave him the medicine and explained the dosage to his granddaughter. She listened intently, jotting it down with a stick on a piece of bark. Ethan looked at the village around him and made a proposal. Hazelford was ready to take the people of Thorn under its protection. not as vassals, as neighbors, a pooling of resources, a shared defense, a shared granary, a shared medical facility. The Baron's granddaughter, whose name was Lena Thorne, looked at him and asked what he wanted in return. Ethan replied that he wanted people who would live, work, and defend their shared home. Lena said that her grandfather would decide once he was back on his feet. Ethan nodded. He left the first aid kit and walked away. On the way back, Ray asked why Ethan had given away the medicine for free. It was worth 60 units of essence. Ethan replied that it wasn't free, that it was an investment, and that Ray would see the return in a week. Ray shrugged and said he'd seen stranger things. On the 61st day, Ethan returned to Hazelford and found a letter on his desk. Not from Thorne, not from Cross. The letter was lying there without an envelope. Neat handwriting, a short message. The author stated that he was a representative of the House of Ash, that the House of Ash was watching Hazelford with interest, that the House of Ash was not an enemy, and that the writer would like to meet. There was no signature. Ethan picked up the letter and opened the interface. Scan. Locally produced paper. Standard ink. Fingerprints. Match found. A wandering bard who arrived in the village 4 days ago. A young woman with a lute. She called herself Emma. She sang in the square after dinner. The villagers took a liking to her. Cheerful, bold, beautiful. Ethan closed the interface. The House of Ash. The third of the great houses. The quietest. The smartest. The one that didn't fight openly but gathered intelligence and waited for the others to grow weak. They sent a spy, not a soldier, a spy disguised as a bard, who had been walking around the village for 4 days, singing songs and memorizing everything she saw. Ethan knew what he had to do according to the logic of war. Arrest her, interrogate her, exile her, or execute her. He did neither. He found Emma by the well. She was sitting on a rock, tuning her lute. 21 years old. Auburn hair, freckles, a smile that came and went like a musical instrument. Ethan sat down beside her. He said he'd heard her last night, that she sang well. He asked if she'd stay for the harvest festival in 2 weeks. Emma looked at him with mild surprise. Then she smiled. She said she'd stay if they fed her. Ethan said they would, and he'd pay her extra in silver, and she'd get her own room. Emma thanked him. Nice. Professional. Like someone who's used to being liked because survival depends on it. Ethan stood up and left. He didn't expose her, didn't hint that he knew, didn't try to recruit her. He simply treated her like a human being, like a wandering bard who needed a roof over her head and dinner. Let him watch. Let him listen. Let her see what Hazelford is doing. Ethan had no intention of hiding his trump cards from the House of Ash, because his main trump card wasn't in the ash tree, not in the armor, not in the medical bay. His main trump card was that the people of Hazelford were well-fed, healthy, and free, and that couldn't be hidden. It could only be shown. On the 63rd day, Baron Thorne got out of bed. The antibiotics had worked. The fever was gone. The old man was back on his feet for the first time in a month. Lena brought him to Ethan. Baron Thorne looked at Hazelford, at the grain silo, at the medical wing, at the fields with green shoots, at the fighters in matte armor, at the children running down the street without hiding. He was silent for a long time. Then he said he agreed. Thorne would join Hazelford, not as a vassal, as an ally. 148 people. Ethan accepted them. Every single one. He entered their data into the interface. He assigned housing, food, and jobs. He sent 3 men to the militia. He sent 1 woman who knew how to work with herbs to Ari in the medical unit for training. He seated old Thorne next to him on the council. The old man had experience, 30 years as a baron. He knew this world better than Ethan ever would. Hazelford had grown to 370 people. Yesenia's interface showed the inflow of essence, 40 units a day, steady, and it was growing. Every new person who felt safe added a drop to the overall flow. On the 65th day, the border shield was activated. On the 68th day, Ethan roused the second commander archivist. This decision was harder for him than the first. 800 units of essence, a huge amount. But he didn't just need an officer, he needed a tactician. Someone who knew how to command not just 9 fighters, but the entire battlefield. A woman emerged from the archives. She looked to be 28 years old, black hair pulled back into a tight bun, a straight back, cold, attentive eyes. She surveyed the room in 3 seconds. She noted the exits, the windows, Ethan's position, the distance to the door. Then she looked at Ethan and introduced herself. Major Pak Mia, Yasenia 7, Operations Division. The last active officer on the command staff at the time of stasis. Ethan introduced himself in return. Mia listened. Then she asked what the current strategic status was. Ethan explained. Everything. The village, refugees, fighters, essence, the crosshouse, 200 fighters on the way, the border shield, the communications module, supplies. Mia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was silent for a minute. Then she said that the situation was dire but not hopeless, and that she needed to survey the positions. Ethan led her through Hazelford. Mia walked and assessed the situation, silently, professionally. She looked at Maury's trenches and nodded. She looked at the barricades and shook her head. She looked at the militiamen Daniel was herding around the square and pursed her lips. When the inspection was over, she told Ethan 3 things. First, Maury's barriers are good against small units. Against 200, they're useless. A complete overhaul of the defensive lines is needed. Second, the militia isn't ready. Not because Daniel is a bad instructor, because there's not enough time. We need to change our approach. Don't teach them to fight. Teach them to perform a single function. Each militiaman has one task. Hold the position, carry shells, put out fires, carry out the wounded. Nothing more. Third, the shield won't withstand a prolonged siege. We need to win quickly. One strike, a decisive one, or don't fight at all. Ethan listened and realized that this man was worth every one of the 800 men. Mia and Daniel met the next morning. Ethan watched. Daniel stood up straight. A new knee, the same old pride. Mia looked at her with the same appraising gaze she used to look at everything. Daniel tensed. She was used to being the only soldier in the village. Now someone had appeared who knew more about war than she ever would. Mia said she'd seen Daniel working with the militiamen, that her basic training was good, that her individual technique was excellent. Then she added that none of that mattered if 200 men came after them in 10 days. Daniel clenched her teeth. Mia continued. She said she needed a second-in-command on the front lines, someone who knew every militiaman by name, someone they trusted, someone who would stand with them in formation when things went wrong. She asked Daniel if she was ready. Daniel replied that she was always ready. Mia nodded. No smile, no approval. She simply took note. They began working together. It was hard. Mia was demanding to the point of cruelty. She reorganized the entire defense system in 4 days. The Maury trenches were deepened and widened. The barricades were relocated. 3 lines of defense were established instead of 1. The first line was for traps and delaying tactics. The second line was for direct fire. The third line served as a shield, and the last line of defense. The militiamen were divided into groups based on their roles: a containment group, a supply group, an evacuation group. Everyone knew their task. One task, no more. Maury worked around the clock. His expertise in siege engineering came into its own. He wasn't building walls, he was building a system. Every moat, every barricade, every stake was part of a single plan that forced the enemy to move exactly where Mia wanted them to go. On the 70th day, the communications module was activated. Ethan turned it on at night. The interface displayed a map of the continent, hundreds of points, domains, fortresses, villages, camps. Most were gray, dead, or conquered. A few were yellow, still alive. Ethan found the barony of Melda, the one Cal had mentioned. 200 souls, a young baroness, a day and a half's journey to the north. He established contact. A reply came an hour later. Baroness Melda's name was Sophie, a young voice, tired, wary. Ethan introduced himself. He told her about Hazelford, about the shield, about the medical unit, about the grain silo. He proposed an alliance. Sophie listened. Then she asked why she should trust a man she'd never seen. Ethan answered simply, because in 10 days, House Cross will come for Hazelford, and then for her. Alone they'll fall. Together, maybe not. Sophie was silent for a long time. Then she said she'd think about it. The connection was cut off. Ethan wasn't upset. He knew that in her situation, thinking about it was almost a yes. On the 72nd day, Jean knocked on the door of the Baron's house late in the evening. Ethan was working on supply spreadsheets. She came in and placed a stack of papers on the table. A complete inventory of Hazelford's supplies: grain, water, medicines, building materials, tools, livestock, seeds. Everything was calculated. Everything was broken down by category. Everything included consumption projections for 30, 60, and 90 days. Ethan read and couldn't stop. Every figure was accurate. Every projection took into account variables he hadn't even considered himself. Population growth due to new refugees, seasonal crop declines, tool wear and tear, diseases, losses during a siege. Jean stood by the table and waited. Ethan looked up and said it was the best report he'd seen in 2 lifetimes. Then he paused. In 2 lifetimes. He said it out loud. Gina looked at him, intently, not frightened, not suspiciously, analytically. She asked what he meant. Ethan paused. Then he said it was a long story. Gina sat down in the chair across from him. She said she was in no hurry. Ethan looked at her. The heiress of a destroyed house. The girl who had pretended to be a peasant for 3 weeks. Who had carried her brother in her arms through burning villages. Who could count grain more accurately than anyone else in this world. He could have lied. He could have brushed it off with a joke. He could have changed the subject. Instead, he told her the truth. Not all of it, just part of it. He said he wasn't from this world, that he'd ended up here by accident, that in his world, he counted cargo for the army, that here, he counted grain and people, that the difference between the two turned out to be smaller than he'd thought. Jean listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was silent. Then she asked one thing. The cube he carries in his pocket, is that from there? Ethan nodded. Jin was silent for a moment longer. Then she said quietly that her father had believed in the integrity of the great houses until the very end, that he had refused to flee when Vulcan came, that he had stood on the wall of his fortress and waited for the rules of the trial to protect him. The rules did not protect him. She said she believed neither in the rules, nor in the great houses, nor in the gods' architects. But she believed in numbers, and the numbers showed that people lived longer with Ethan than without him. It wasn't a declaration of love, not a vow of loyalty. It was something else entirely, a partnership, based not on feelings but on calculation, and that was precisely why it was worth so much. They pored over the spreadsheets until late into the night. Ethan showed her the Yasanya interface, not all of it, just the inventory reports, the supply chains, and the production capacities. Jin looked at the numbers, her eyes ablaze. She asked questions, smart ones, precise ones, uncomfortable ones. Why does essence convert non-linearly? Why doesn't the production line scale? Why is the range limited? Ethan answered what he knew. For the rest, he honestly admitted he didn't know. At one point, Jeannie found an error in the column of numbers that Ethan had missed. The House Cross Army marched on Hazelford on the 78th day. Cal was the first to spot them. Dust on the southern road, a long column, 213 soldiers, 4 siege guns, a supply train of 20 wagons. It wasn't Victor Cross leading the way. It was his lieutenant, a man named Marcus Fane, a career military officer, a veteran of 3 campaigns. Ethan received the report while standing in the command post, the second floor of the Baron's house, a map on the wall, Yasenya's interface before his eyes. Mia was beside him. Behind her stood Jeannie with the supply ledger. Downstairs, Daniel was organizing the troops. Mia calmly assessed the enemy. 213, siege weapons, a professional commander. She said they wouldn't withstand a direct assault. The shield would hold out for 2 or 3 days, then the essence would run out. She proposed a plan. Not a passive defense, an active defense. The difference is that active defense involves striking the enemy before they can mobilize for an assault. Night raids, sabotage. Destroying the supply train, demolishing the siege weapons, forcing the enemy to expend resources even before the siege begins. Ethan listened and nodded. It made sense. In his past life, he'd seen how siege logistics worked. A besieging army consumes more resources than the besieged one. 200 men far from their supply bases. Every day they eat. Every day they burn firewood. Every day their horses chew hay. If the supply train is destroyed, the army will start to starve in 5 days. In 10 days, it would lose its combat effectiveness. In 15, it would collapse. Ethan approved the plan. Mia sprang into action. The first night, Cross's army set up camp 3 kilometers from Hazelford, outside the shield's range, beyond the reach of the moats and traps. Marcus Fane knew his business. He didn't charge head-on into a fortified village. He was going to strangle it, block the roads, cut off the quarry, cut off the fields. Wait, Mia didn't give him that chance. On the first night, Ray and 2 infantrymen went outside the perimeter, quietly, without a flame, in matte armor that didn't reflect light. They circled the camp from the west. They found the supply train. 20 wagons of provisions, 4 sentries on guard. Ray took out the first one without a sound. The infantryman took care of the second and third. The fourth raised the alarm. Ray retreated, but not before setting 3 wagons on fire. The fire caught quickly. Dry wood, cloth, grain. The camp was roused. Chaos. Shouts. Marcus Fane rushed out of his tent and organized the firefighting effort. They saved 17 of the 20 wagons. 3 burned completely. With them won about 15% of the provisions. In the morning, Fane deployed reinforced guards around the supply train, 20 men instead of 4. 20 men who could no longer take part in the siege. Mia smiled when she heard the report. That had been her goal, not to destroy the supply train, but to force the enemy to waste men on its defense. Every soldier tied to the supply train is a soldier missing from the front lines. The second night, Cal was alone. With a bow, he made his way to the southern hill from which he could see the camp. He waited for the guard shift change, the moment when the old shift was leaving and the new one hadn't taken over yet. 3 arrows, 2 hit their mark, 1 sentry killed, 1 wounded. Cal retreated into the darkness. Fane tripled the number of guards, 30 more men. Of the 213 fighters, 50 were now standing guard instead of preparing for the assault. The third night, Mori, a specialist in siege engineering. He went outside the perimeter with 2 militiamen and mined the approaches to the village from the south. Not with mines, with traps, pits with stakes covered by branches, traps with strings tied to bells, false trails leading to dead ends. That morning, Fine's reconnaissance team lost 2 men. One fell into a pit with stakes. The second got lost on the false trails and walked right into an infantryman's position. He surrendered without a fight. Fine was a professional. He understood what was happening. They were methodically wearing him down. Not attacking, just wearing him down. Every night he lost men or supplies. Every morning his army grew a little smaller, a little hungrier, a little more nervous. On the 4th day, he made a decision, an assault, without waiting for full preparations, without waiting for reinforcements to arrive. Now, while the army was still combat ready. Ethan saw movement in the camp at dawn on the 4th day. The interface showed it. Combat formations were being set up. Siege weapons were being deployed. Fine was launching an attack. Mia was ready. She had been waiting for this. The entire plan was based on forcing Fine to attack early, before he could figure out the defense system, before he could find all the traps, before his reconnaissance could draw up a complete map. Cross's army advanced in 3 columns: center, left flank, right flank. Siege weapons behind the central column. By the book. Properly. Against an ordinary village, that would have been more than enough. Hazelford was no ordinary village. The first line of defense, traps and delaying tactics. The central column entered the area of the ditches. The front ranks fell into the pits, stakes, screams. The rear ranks pressed forward, a stampede. The column slowed down. The left flank took a detour along a false trail. The trail led to a dead end between 2 ditches. A barricade stood nearby. Behind the barricade were 3 of Yesenya's infantrymen. The right flank ran into Daniel. She stood with 15 militiamen in a narrow passage between the houses. Shields, spears, formation. The passage was 3 people wide. The flank attacked. The formation held. Daniel stood in the front row. Her sword moved like a metronome, steady, precise, without pause. The militiamen behind her held their shields and shouted, not out of fear, but because Daniel was shouting, and they were shouting with her. Mia was giving orders from the 2nd floor. Ethan stood beside her. The interface showed the entire battlefield, every point, every strike, every fall. Mia issued orders calmly. Move 2 men to the left flank. Pull the supply group behind the shield. Move Ray to the center. Ethan listened and learned. This wasn't a fight, it was a game of chess in which every piece was bleeding. The central column broke through the first line, 30 casualties. The second line lay ahead of them. Firefight. Cal was on the roof with a bow. 2 infantrymen were in position. Arrows, throwing knives, darts from Yasin's catalog. The center was bogged down. The siege weapons were brought up. The first stone struck the shield. The shield held. Essence down by 18 units. The second stone, down by 22. The third, minus 25. Each strike cost more than the last. Ethan kept track of the essence consumption. The reserve was 813. At the current rate, it would last for 4 hours of continuous bombardment. Mia looked at him. She understood the problem. She said the siege weapons had to be destroyed. That was the priority. Ethan nodded. Mia gave the order. Ray, 2 infantrymen, a sortie, through the underground passage that Mori had dug in 2 days. Exit behind the central column. Straight to the guns. Ray emerged from underground 15 meters from the first gun. The crew didn't have time to react. Ray destroyed the cannon while the 2 infantrymen held off the guards. 30 seconds. The first cannon was out of commission. He dashed to the second one. The guards came to their senses. A fight broke out. Ray took a sword blow to the forearm. His armor held, but his arm was jammed. He switched the blade to his left hand and continued. The second gun was destroyed. The third, the fourth. Ray and the 2 infantrymen retreated back into the tunnel. 20 of Cross's soldiers gave chase. Mori collapsed the entrance. The battle for the siege weapons lasted 4 minutes. All 4 were destroyed. Fane lost his main siege weapon. The shelling ceased. The shield held. The battle lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of blood, screams, and dust. Ethan stood in the command post and counted. Casualties. Our own. The enemies. Everyone. By name. 3 militiamen were seriously wounded. 1 was killed. Hazelford's first casualty, a farmer named Heinrich. That very same old farmer who had been feeling the sprouts in the field. An arrow through the throat. Instantly, Ethan saw it on the interface. The green dot turned gray. He stood there, staring at the gray dot, and something inside him grew heavy and cold. By evening, Fane had retreated. His casualties? 71 killed, 43 wounded. Of the 213, 99 remained combat-ready, without siege weapons, with 3 days' worth of supplies. He could have continued. He could wait for reinforcements. He could try again. But Mia didn't give him that chance. At dawn on the 5th day, she led all of Yasin's fighters outside the perimeter. 9 infantrymen in matte armor. Daniel. 30 of Melda's militiamen. They formed ranks in front of Fane's camp. They didn't attack. They just stood there, silently, in the dawn light. Fane stepped out of his tent and saw them. He stared for a long time. Then he turned to his men, hungry, exhausted, demoralized, and then back to the ranks before him. He gave an order. Retreat. After Fane's retreat, Hazelford was given a month, not of peace, a respite. Ethan made use of every hour. On the 80th day, the population had surpassed 600. Refugees were pouring in. Rumors of the Baron who had crushed Cross's army and was feeding everyone without taxes were spreading across the continent faster than Ethan could build houses. Tom Rhines worked non-stop. His crew of 12 carpenters erected a new house every 3 days. Jean managed the supplies with a precision that even frightened Ethan. She knew how much grain was in every sack, how much milk each goat produced, how many days each supply would last. On the 85th day, Hana Lee arrived. Ethan remembered that day because she entered the village in a way that made it impossible not to notice her. 22 years old, broad shoulders, sunburned hands wrapped in dirty rags, a blacksmith's hammer on her back, heavy and black with soot. She walked down the main street and people parted, not out of fear, but because she radiated an energy that filled the space around her. She stopped in front of the Baron's house and asked loudly, "Who's the Baron here?" Ethan came out. Hana looked down at him. She was half a head taller. She said she had come from the village of Colehart, that the village no longer existed, that the House of Cross had burned it down 2 weeks ago, that her father had been the best blacksmith in 3 provinces, that he had died at the anvil with a hammer in his hands, that she had taken the hammer and walked here for 9 days. Ethan asked what she wanted. Hana raised her hands. She unwrapped the bandages. Burns covered both her palms and wrists, old scars and fresh blisters. She said she needed a forge, that she was a blacksmith, the best apprentice in 3 villages, that her hands hurt so much she couldn't hold a hammer for more than an hour. But she was a blacksmith, and she would remain a blacksmith as long as she drew breath. Ethan led her to the medical bay. Ari examined her hands. The burns were deep. Nerve damage. Partial loss of sensation. Full recovery was impossible without serious regenerative therapy, which Yasin didn't have. Ethan sat at the interface and thought. He couldn't give Hana new hands, but he could give her something else. He found the section, Production Modules, Foundry, in the catalog. The cost was 600 units. The equipment included magnetic grippers and manipulators. Gesture control. A blacksmith in such a foundry didn't hold the hammer with his hands. He guided it with his mind and body movements. The hands became not a tool, but a conduit. Ethan set up the foundry on the 88th day. Hana stepped inside and froze. An anvil made of an alloy she'd never seen before, a furnace with a controlled temperature, a magnetic hammer that hovered in the air and obeyed the movement of her hand. She held out her scorched palm. The hammer moved toward her. It hovered. She moved her hand downward. The hammer struck the anvil. A clear, ringing sound. Hana stood and listened to that ringing. Then she moved her hand again. A blow. Another. Another. She was forging, not with her hands, with her will. An hour later, she walked out of the workshop with eyes full of fire. Not tears, fire. She found Ethan in the square. She approached him. She set a full mug of beer down in front of him. Ethan never found out where she'd gotten the beer in Hazelford. She asked directly and loudly, "My lord, are you busy right now, or can I make you happy for a couple of hours?" Ethan choked on his beer. The square fell silent. Daniel, by the training field, raised an eyebrow. Ari, by the medical unit, turned away a little faster than she should have. Jian, in the grain silo, rolled her eyes so expressively you could practically hear it. Ethan cleared his throat. He said he was very busy, that he was glad she liked the workshop, that tomorrow he'd send an architectural engineer to demonstrate all the equipment's functions, and that the beer was excellent. Hannah burst out laughing, loudly, loud enough for the whole square to hear. She said he was the first man who'd turned her down and blushed while doing it. Then she took her mug and went back to the workshop. Ethan sat in the square and felt his ears burning. Mia approached from behind and whispered that in Ya-sen, 4,000 years ago, blacksmiths were like that too. Ethan asked, "In what way?" Mia answered with one word: straightforward. On the 99th day, Ethan received a message via the communication module, not from the Allies, from the House of Ash, an official one, signed with the House Head's seal. A proposal for a meeting. Neutral territory, no weapons, one-on-one. Ethan read the message 3 times. The House of Ash wasn't at war. The House of Ash was thinking. And if they were proposing a meeting, it meant they'd already calculated everything and decided that Ethan was more useful to them alive. Mia was against it, categorically. She said it was a trap, that the House of Ash never acted straightforwardly, that behind every one of their proposals lay 3 layers of hidden conditions. Danielle was against it. She said that a one-on-one meeting without weapons was an invitation to murder. Jin remained silent. Then she said quietly that if the House of Pepla wanted to kill Ethan, they wouldn't have sent a letter, they would have sent Emma. Ethan looked at Jin, then at Mia, then he made his decision. He would go. Before leaving, he found Emma. She was sitting by the well, plucking the strings of her lute. 2 months in Hazelford. She'd been living here for 2 months, eating here, singing here, sleeping in the room Ethan had given her, getting paid in silver for her performances. No one questioned her, no one watched her, no one restricted her. Ethan sat down beside her. He told her he was going to meet with the House of Ash. Emma stopped playing. Her fingers froze on the strings. She didn't look at him. Ethan said he knew who she was, from the 3rd day on, that the interface had shown him her file within the 1st hour, that he hadn't said anything because she didn't need to be pressured. She needed time. Emma was silent, for a long time. Then she turned to him. Her eyes were wet, her face was set. She asked why he was saying this now. Ethan replied that it was because he wanted her to choose. He was going to see her employers. She could tell them whatever she wanted. She could go with him. She could stay. She could leave. He wouldn't hold her back. Emma looked at him. Then she stood up. She went to her room. She closed the door. In the morning, she stood at the gate with a lute on her back. When Ethan approached, she said quietly, "My lord, I think I've gone bad. I can't work with them anymore." She pulled a stack of papers from her bosom, ciphers, communication codes, and a map of the House of Ash's spy network in the eastern provinces. She laid them on the ground in front of Ethan. He picked up the papers. He looked at Emma. She stood before him, small, angry, and frightened all at once. He said the room was hers, and the silver too. Emma blinked, then she nodded. Then she turned and walked toward the well. A minute later, the sound of a lute drifted from there, a false note. Then another. Then a melody Ethan had never heard before. Quiet, hesitant, genuine. Ethan set off for the meeting. He picked up Ray. The meeting was scheduled at an abandoned tower halfway between Hazelford and the territory of the House of Ash. The head of the House of Ash didn't show up. His right-hand man arrived, a man named Sengo Mao, old, gaunt, eyes like a snake's. He sat behind a stone table and looked at Ethan as if he were reading him like an open book. Sengo said that the House of Ash wasn't interested in a war with Hazelford, that the House of Ash had observed and seen enough, that Ethan was breaking the rules of the trial in a way that had never existed before. Sengo proposed neutrality. The House of Ash would not attack Hazelford. It would not help Cross. It would not help Vulcan. In exchange for one thing, information. Sengo wanted to know what the ash tree was. Ethan looked at him. Then he said that the ash tree was a tool, an old one, a very old one, and that the only thing the House of Ash needed to know was that the ash tree works only for those who care about people, not for those who want power. Sengo looked at Ethan for a long time. Then he smiled, subtly. He said that Ethan was either a genius or an idealist, and that in either case he was interesting to deal with. The neutrality agreement was signed. Ethan returned to Hazelford with a treaty that removed one of the 3 great houses from the board. 2 remained, Cross and Vulcan, and they were enough. The 100th day, Hazelford was no longer a village. 940 people. Stone houses instead of wooden ones. A wall along the outer perimeter, not tall but sturdy. 4 towers. Hana's foundry was operating in 2 shifts. The fields were yielding a second harvest of the season. The granary was 3/4 full. The medical ward had been expanded. Ari had trained 4 assistants. Kanso was treating the severe cases. The less serious ones went to Ari and her team. Ethan stood on the tower and looked out over the town, because it was already a town. Small, crowded, noisy, lively. Down below in the square, Daniel was drilling the militia. 60 fighters, not farmers with pitchforks, trained men in light Yesenia armor armed with spears and shields. Mia stood next to Ethan on the tower. She said the militia was ready for open field combat, not a siege, a battle. Ethan nodded. He knew what that meant. Victor Cross wouldn't send another fine. Victor would come himself, and he wouldn't bring 200, 1,000, maybe more. The communications module was active every evening. Ethan spoke with 3 small baronies in the north, with 2 surviving settlements in the south. With a group of refugees who had set up their own camp in the forest and refused to answer to anyone but were willing to trade. The network was growing, slowly, fragile, but growing. On the 102nd day, Ethan made a decision he'd been putting off for 2 months. He went down to Yasen. Physically, the cube opened a portal to a pocket dimension and Ethan stepped inside for the first time. What he saw stunned him. The base was enormous. Hangars stretched into the darkness. Barracks with thousands of berths stood empty. Production lines lay frozen in anticipation. The command center glowed with screens displaying data from 4,000 years ago, the final reports from the last war lost by civilization. Ethan walked through the corridors and read. The walls remembered, scratches from blows, traces of burns. In one corridor, a name was scratched into the wall. Ryokan, 7th Strike Force. We're holding on. Someone had written this 4,000 years ago, and someone never lived to see the reply. Ethan reached the end of the base, the lowest level. A locked door. The door was massive, made of a metal Ethan didn't recognize. 3 layers of protective circuits. The interface displayed. Isolation unit. Status. Active. Contents. 1 object. Biological. In stasis. Previous operator. Ethan stood before the door and felt the essence pulsing through the walls. Every unit he spent passed through the base, through these walls, through this door, and each time the walls grew slightly thinner. He went upstairs and called for Mia. He closed the door to the Baron's house. He sat down across from her and told her he'd been downstairs, that he'd seen the door, that he wanted to know the truth. Mia looked at him. Her expression didn't change, but her hands, resting on her knees, clenched into fists. She was silent for a minute. Then she began to speak. The previous operator's name was Cain Daros. He was a brilliant commander, a strategist, a leader. Under his command, Yasen 7 won battle after battle. People followed him, died for him, trusted him. And then he began to change. Slowly, imperceptibly. He started appointing commanders who were loyal only to him, not the base, not the mission, to him personally. He began to see people as a resource, soldiers as units, the living as a source of essence. He stopped counting them by name. He started counting them by numbers. Mia fell silent. Then she continued. She said she had been his deputy, that she had seen him change, that she had tried to talk to him, that he wouldn't listen. That in the end, he tried to use Yasen against his own civilization, against the very people he had sworn to protect. Mia signed the preservation order. She personally locked Cain in the isolation block. She personally activated the stasis protocol. And she spent 4,000 years in the darkness with that decision. Ethan listened. Then he asked why she hadn't told him sooner. Mia answered bluntly, because she was afraid. If Ethan had found out that every unit of essence spent weakened the chamber's walls, he might have stopped producing soldiers, and without soldiers, Hazelford would perish. Ethan sat and thought. The logic was flawless and monstrous. Every time he created an infantryman to guard the widow Martha, every time he deployed a module that saved someone's life, every time the walls of Cain Daros's chamber grew thinner. His kindness was bringing disaster closer. He asked Mia how much time was left. Mia replied that at the current rate of consumption, about a year, maybe less if he ramped up production. Ethan stood up. He walked over to the window. He looked at the city beyond the glass. 900 people, who needed to be protected. To protect them, he needed soldiers. Soldiers cost essence. Essence unleashes the monster, a vicious cycle. He turned to Mia. He said there was a third option, not to stop production and not to wait for Cain's release. To prepare, to know exactly when the walls would fall, to be ready when it happened, and to meet Cain Daros not as a victim but as an operator who knows his base better than its previous owner. Mia looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly that Cain was a genius, that he knew Yasin better than anyone, that he was more dangerous than any of the great houses. Ethan replied that Cain knew Yasin as a weapon, but he, Ethan, knew Yasin as a warehouse, and that in a warehouse, the warehouse keeper always wins. Mia looked at him, and for the first time in all the time he'd known her, something resembling a smile appeared on her face. On the 105th day, Ethan convened a council. Everyone. Mia, Daniel, Ari, Jinne, Hana, Hanso, Emma, Sophie Melda, Tom Rhines, Old Baron Thorn. He told them everything. Who he was, where he came from, how he ended up here, what the ash was, and that a man was sleeping down below who would one day wake up. He told them about Cain Daros, about how every unit of essence weakens the walls, about how they have a year, maybe less. The room was silent. Ari sat with her eyes closed. Daniel stood by the wall with her arms crossed. Jin stared at the table. Hana twirled a mug between her scorched fingers. Emma plucked the strings of her lute silently. Mia stood by the door and watched. Ari was the first to speak. She asked calmly, "The medicines that saved the boy during the first week, are they from this base?" Ethan nodded. Ari nodded back. She said she didn't care where they came from. The boy is alive. That's the only thing that matters. Daniel put it more succinctly. She said her leg works, that the Baron who gave her the leg could be from beyond the stars. She'll stay. Hana said she finally understood where the Baron got such strange expressions, that in her village no one ever talked about quarterly reports. Winter arrived on the 120th day. The first snow fell on the fields of Hazelford, and the town fell silent. The population had surpassed 1,200. The 4 surrounding villages had formally joined the Union. Ethan ruled over a territory that could no longer be called a barony. It was a principality, small, young, but real. Winter was testing its mettle. The granary was 2/3 full, enough for 4 months at the current population level. The soil enrichment module didn't operate in winter. The fields lay dormant. The quarry in the wastelands had become more dangerous. There were more creatures in the winter. They were drawn to the warmth, to the people. On the 125th day, a pack of 12 Class C creatures attacked the northern outpost. The militiamen held their position for 20 minutes until Ray arrived with 2 infantrymen. Casualties. 1 militiaman. An 18-year-old boy named Finn, the son of one of the refugees from the first wave. Ethan wrote his name next to Heinrich's, the second line on the casualty list. He swore to himself that this list would be the shortest of any he had ever kept. On the 130th day, Emma brought news that changed everything. House Cross and House Vulcan had formed an alliance, an official, with a hostage exchange, with joint command. The alliance had a single goal, Hazelford. Victor Cross offered Vulcan a simple deal. A joint army would destroy Hazelford. The territory would be split in half. The secret of the anomaly baron would be revealed. The benefits would be mutual. House Vulcan agreed. The combined army numbered about 12,000 fighters. Of those, 8,000 were crosses and 4,000 were Vulcans, plus siege weapons, plus mages, plus cavalry, against Ethan's 1,500 fighters. The math wasn't just bad, it was impossible. Ethan sat poring over the map, calculating, recalculating, looking for a way out. Mia stood beside him. She said that a direct defense was out of the question, that 12,000 would crush any fortifications, that the border shield would hold out for a day at most under such pressure, that a different solution was needed. Ethan nodded. He knew. He'd been thinking about it for a week, and the solution he'd come up with was the kind his colleagues in San Diego would call madness. He proposed neither a defense nor an attack, an evacuation. Not a retreat, A strategic evacuation to get the entire civilian population out. 1,200 people across the wastelands, westward, to a place where neither Cross nor Vulcan would go because the wastelands kill armies. Small groups protected by Yasin's fighters, along routes that Cal had scouted, past the creatures' nests, through the quarry, to the valley beyond the wastelands that Yasin's interface had mentioned, the Valley of the Silent Stone, protected by natural walls, with water, with soil, with ore. New Hazelford. Mia listened to the plan. Then she said it wasn't madness, it was logistics, pure logistics, and that's exactly why it might work. Victor Cross is expecting a siege. He's expecting a fight. He doesn't expect the enemy to just walk away. Ethan called a council meeting. He laid out the plan. The reactions were mixed. Danielle was against it. She said that Hazelford was home, that people had built it with their own hands, that to give it up without a fight meant losing everything they'd worked for. Jean agreed. She said that a home isn't just walls. A home is the people, and the living are more important than the dead. Ari said there were 14 critically ill patients in the medical wing who couldn't be transported. Ethan replied that the medical wing was the Yesenia module. He could pack it up and set it up again at a new location in 2 days. Hannah asked what would happen to the foundry. Ethan gave the same answer. A module. It folds up. It unfolds. Emma said that if they left through the wastelands, the House of Ash would lose sight of them, and that this could be both good and bad. Sophie Meldy said that her people had already abandoned the house once and come here. They could do it again. If there's a plan ahead, not just emptiness. Old Thorn was silent. Then he said that in 30 years as Baron, he'd learned one thing. Stones remain. People leave. And that if people leave alive, the stones can be put back together. Ethan listened to everyone. Then he turned to Danielle. She was standing by the wall, her arms crossed, her jaw clenched. The crossing through the wastelands took 11 days. 11 days of gray earth, dead stone, cold wind. Creatures that followed the column like wolves following a herd. Cal scouted the path ahead. Ray and the infantry held the flanks. Mia coordinated the movement. Danielle led the rear guard. Ethan walked in the center of the column, next to the wagons, next to the children, next to the wounded. He kept track. Water consumption. Food consumption, distance to the next water source, speed of travel, delays. Every number was a matter of life and death. The first night, a camp among the rocks. The perimeter shield was deployed at its minimum radius, 100 meters. People slept haphazardly. Children cried. The elderly coughed. Ari walked among them with a first aid kit. Han So helped. Ethan didn't sleep. He sat at the edge of the shield and stared into the darkness. Shadows were moving there. Creatures, Class C, small ones, but there were many of them. They circled outside the shield's perimeter and howled. Low, dragging, a sound that made your blood run cold. Day 3, we lost a cow. She broke her leg on the rocks. We had to put her down. We distributed the meat. Day 4, a pack of creatures attacked the rear of the column. 8 Class C specimens and 1 Class B. Daniel led the fight. The militiamen held their formation. Ray approached from the flank. The battle lasted 7 minutes. The creatures were killed. Casualties. 2 militiamen were wounded, 1 seriously, deep bites to the thigh. Ari performed surgery under field conditions. Han So held the lantern. The militiamen survived. Day 7. Water. Ethan found an underground spring using Yasin's interface. The magical background indicated an aquifer 20 meters below the surface. Mori dug with the militiamen for 6 hours. Water began to flow. Clean, cold. People drank eagerly. The children laughed. For the first time in a week. Day 8. Jean came to Ethan with the calculations. At the current rate of consumption, the grain would last another 8 days. The trek would take another 3 or 4 days. They had supplies, but just barely enough. Ethan nodded. Barely enough, his favorite scenario, when every gram counts, when logistics ceases to be an abstraction and becomes the difference between life and death. The 9th day. The wasteland began to change. Gray rock gave way to brown, then dark, then grass appeared. Sparse, tough, but alive. The interface showed they were approaching the Valley of the Silent Stone. Distance, 40 kilometers. Day 10. They saw it. The valley opened up suddenly beyond a rocky ridge. Wide, green. A river glistened below. Cliffs rose like walls all around. A natural fortress. A single passage led inside. Narrow, 200 meters. It could be blocked by 10 fighters. The people stopped on the ridge and looked on. In silence. A woman with a baby began to cry. Old Thorne dropped to his knees. Tom Raines took off his hat and stood holding it in his hands. Hannah said aloud that the view was certainly beautiful, but she would have preferred a hot bath. Someone laughed. Then another. Then everyone was laughing, from exhaustion, from relief, from the fact that they had made it. The 11th day. The descent into the valley. Setting up camp. Ethan worked non-stop. He set up the grain storage facility first, then the medical unit, then the border barrier at the entrance to the valley, then the water treatment plant by the river. People were pitching tents, chopping down trees for houses, digging, building. Jian was distributing supplies. Ari was treating the sick. Han So examined the wounded after the crossing. Daniel set up guard posts. Mia organized the perimeter. Hannah stood in the middle of the valley with her father's hammer behind her back and said aloud that she needed a site for the workshop, a level 1, with a good breeze. "This one will do." "No, this one." "No, the first one after all." Ethan listened and didn't interrupt. Emma sat on a rock and played the lute. The melody was different, not the one she'd played in Hazelford, a new one, for a new place. On the 12th day in the valley, Ethan stood on a cliff above the camp. It was early morning. Fog was rising from the river. The people below moved like ants. Small, tenacious, alive. 1,200 people. Everyone had made it, all alive. Not a single gray dot on the interface during the entire journey. Mia walked over and stood beside him. She was silent. Then she said that over 4,000 years she had seen many commanders. That Cain Daros was the best, that he had won every battle, every campaign, every war, and lost the only thing that mattered, people. She said that Ethan had lost Hazelford, lost the walls and towers and fields and homes, and won every single person by name. Ethan stood there in silence. Then he said that Hazelford wasn't lost. Hazelford is right here. He pointed to the people below. Mia nodded. Then she said one more thing, quietly, almost to herself. She said that 4,000 years ago, when she signed the preservation order, she didn't know why. Now she knows. So that one day, she could wake up and see an operator who chooses people over victory. She didn't say anything else, but she stood next to him on the cliff and didn't leave. And for her, that meant everything. On the 15th day, Kell's reconnaissance team in the valley reported back. Cross Vulcan's army had taken Hazelford. 12,000 soldiers entered the empty city. Victor Cross stood in the square and looked at the empty houses, empty barns, empty walls, traces of 1,000 people who had vanished into the night. Cal said that Victor stood in the square for a long time. Then he turned to his men and said something Cal couldn't make out, but Victor's expression was strange. Not angry, not disappointed, pensive, like a man who had seen a move for the first time that he hadn't anticipated. Ethan accepted the report. He looked at the valley, at the walls, at the people, at the river. Then he opened the interface and began to plan. A new city, new walls, new fields, from scratch, like a logistician, as always. A year had passed. The quiet stone valley had become a city, not a village, a city, 2,400 souls, stone houses in 3 rows along the river. A wall at the entrance to the valley, 4 towers, a foundry, a weaving workshop, a school, the first school in the entire history of the trial where they taught reading and arithmetic instead of fencing. Ari taught the children in the morning. In the afternoon, she treated patients. In the evening, she wrote a medical textbook, the first in this world written by someone who had seen both herbal compresses and a diagnostic device. Han So had trained 4 surgeons. Ari was the best of them. She now performed surgeries on her own, smoothly, confidently, without a tremor in her hands. Han So stood nearby and nodded, silently. He was so quietly proud of her that it was almost imperceptible, but Ethan saw it. Danielle commanded a garrison of 300 fighters, 20 of Yesenia's infantrymen and the rest militiamen whom she had transformed into soldiers over the course of a year. Not an elite force, not knights. People who knew how to stand in formation and not run away, who knew each other's names, who fought not for the Baron but for the homes where their children slept. Gina managed the city's entire economy. She had built a distribution system that ran without a hitch. Every resident received what they needed, no more, no less. She found 14 more rounding errors in Ethan's ledgers. He stopped counting after the 5th. Hana was a blacksmith. Her foundry produced tools, weapons, horseshoes, nails, hinges, and locks, everything the city needed. She'd learned to work with a magnetic hammer so well that her creations were better than the ones her father had made by hand. She hadn't forgotten her father's hands, but she'd found her own. Emma was no longer a spy. She was a bard, a real one. She sang in the square every evening, and people came to listen, not because she was beautiful, because her songs were about them. About crossing the wastelands, about the boy saved by medicine, about the blacksmith who rediscovered his hammer, about the captain who ran across the field for the first time in 10 years. Songs that contained no lies. Mia commanded the defense, calmly, methodically. She knew that Cross and Vulcan would find the valley, sooner or later. She knew that Cain Daros would wake up sooner or later. She was preparing for both. But for the first time in 4,000 years, she was doing it not out of fear, but by choice. On the 271st day, Cain Daros woke up. Ethan sensed it through the interface. Alarm, red, flashing, isolation block, status compromised, subject active. He was standing in the middle of the town square when it happened. It was noon. Children were running around the well. A woman was hanging laundry. Old man Thorne was sitting on a bench, basking in the sun. Ethan clenched the cube in his pocket. The portal to Yason opened. He stepped through. The base was humming. The walls vibrated. Red light pulsed through the corridors. Ethan made his way to the top level, to the chamber, to the door that could no longer hold. Mia walked beside him, silently, her blade drawn. Behind them was Ray, 3 infantrymen. Daniel. The door was open. A man stood inside, tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair down to his shoulders, a handsome, expressionless face, eyes that viewed the world as if it were a ledger. Cain Daros, former operator of Yesenia 7. He looked at Ethan, then at Mia. His gaze lingered on Mia. He spoke calmly. "Major Pack, it's been a long time." Mia stood there and didn't answer. Her face was stony. The blade in her hand didn't tremble. Cain shifted his gaze to Ethan. He studied him, assessed him. Then he said he could sense the base, that it had changed, that its energy wasn't flowing where it should, not into weapons, not into soldiers, into grain silos, into hospitals, into some kind of schools. He uttered that word as if it were a curse. Schools. Ethan stood there, looking at him, at the man who, 4,000 years ago, had been a genius, a strategist, a leader, and who had stopped seeing people. Ethan said the base was functioning properly, that it was doing what it was built to do, protecting people. Cain smirked. He said the base was built for war, for victory, so that the strong would survive, not to feed peasants and treat their children. Ethan replied that the strong were those who had survived, and those who had survived were the ones who had been fed and treated. Cain fell silent. Then he raised his hand. Yesenia's interface flashed. Access conflict. 2 operators, 1 active, 1 former. Cain was trying to seize control. The interface requested confirmation. Ethan stood there and felt the base pulling him in one direction and Cain in the other, like 2 hands on a single steering wheel. Cain was stronger, more experienced. He'd known Yasin for 4,000 years, every circuit, every protocol, every loophole. Ethan felt control slipping away. He felt the interface flickering. He felt the connection to the modules in the valley weakening. The shield at the entrance to the valley began to flash. The grain silo lost stability for a split second. The med block shut down for a moment and then came back on. And then something happened that Cain Daros hadn't anticipated. The interface displayed data, essence, incoming flow, source, emotional resonance. 2,400 living people, their anxiety, their fear, their hope, their trust in the operator, not in the base, not in the position, in the person. In Ethan Reed, who counted out rations at night so no one would be forgotten, who wrote down every name, who treated children, repaired roofs, and sent prisoners on their way with full stomachs. The essence gushed forth, not from ore, not from corpses, from people, from gratitude, from trust, from a sense of belonging, from the fact that 2,400 people simultaneously felt that their home was in danger and that they trusted the man who had built that home. The interface choked. The numbers skyrocketed. Cross Vulcan's army found the valley 2 months after Cain's awakening. Intelligence reported 12,000 soldiers under the personal command of Victor Cross. They were marching through the wastelands, losing men to the beasts, losing their supply train, losing time. But they kept going. Victor Cross didn't know how to retreat. Ethan stood in the command post, the new one, at the top of a cliff overlooking the pass into the valley. A map lay before him, the interface. Mia was beside him. Daniel was behind her. Ari was at the hospital. Jean was in supply. Hannah was in the workshop. Emma was on the wall with binoculars. Sophie Melda was with the militia at the pass. 1,500 fighters, 24 of Yasin's infantrymen, 300 trained militiamen. The rest are civilians ready to do whatever they're told, against 12,000. Ethan looked at the numbers and knew they would lose. Not today, not tomorrow, but in a week, in 2. Resources will run out. The essence will burn out. People will get tired. And Victor would keep pressing. Because Victor is smart. Because Victor is patient. Because Victor knows that time is on his side. Ethan closed his eyes. He thought. He went over the numbers. He looked for an option. And he found it. Not in Yasin's manual. Not in Mia's tactics. Not in Daniel's ranks. Within himself. He remembered why he'd come here. Not to the valley. To this world. He remembered his goal. Not the crown. Not victory. The end of the trial. And he remembered what he'd known from day one. Yasin isn't a weapon. Yasin is a tool. And the communication module has a range of 500 kilometers across the entire continent. Ethan opened the communication module. He found a frequency that no one had ever used, a wide open one, accessible to anyone with even a shred of magical perception, to every baron, to every peasant, to every soldier on this continent, and he began to speak. Not orders, not ultimatums, not threats, numbers. He spoke of how many people had died during the 23rd trial. He named the number, 600,000, out of the million who started, 600,000 dead in 10 months. He named the villages that had been burned, 714. He named the baronies that had fallen, 830 out of 1,000. He named the number of children who hadn't lived to see their first winter, a number that made one's throat tighten. He spoke of how much grain had been destroyed in the wars of the great houses, how many people that grain could have fed, for how many years. He spoke of the previous trials, 22 in the history of Iskendria, the total number of casualties, millions, tens of millions. For what? So that a single house could rule for 100 years, and then it all started over again. He spoke calmly, like a logistics officer reading a report. Without anger, without pathos, just numbers, just names, just facts. The communications module carried his voice across the entire continent. The soldiers of the cross heard him as they stood before the passage into the valley. Vulcan's soldiers heard him. The peasants in the conquered villages heard him. The surviving barons heard him. And somewhere far away in the marble halls, the architect gods heard him too. Because Yasin 7 was their creation, and the communications module operated on their frequency. Victor Cross stood at the entrance to the valley and listened. His army stood and listened. 12,000 men, in silence. Ethan spoke for an hour and a half. Then he fell silent. The silence was so profound that you could hear the wind rustling the grass. Then Ethan said his final words. He said he didn't want to be king, that he didn't want to win, that he wanted only one thing, for the trial to end, forever, so that no baron would ever cast lots again, so that no village would ever burn for the sake of someone's crown, so that the architect gods would look at their ledger and see the price people pay for their game. Silence. A minute. 2. 3. Then a soldier stepped out of the ranks of Cross's army. 1. He took off his helmet, placed it on the ground, took off his gloves, placed them beside it. He stood up and looked toward the passage into the valley. A second followed him, a third, a 10th, a 100th. They didn't run, they didn't mutiny. They simply took off their helmets and stood there, one after another. Victor Cross looked at his army, at the men who had heard the numbers and stopped wanting to fight, not because they were afraid, but because, for the first time, someone had counted them not as units of an army, but as human beings. An hour later, a third of the army stood without helmets. 2 hours later, half. By evening, only Victor's personal guard and Vulcan's officers remained. Victor Cross stepped out into the passageway alone, unarmed. Ethan came down to meet him, alone as well. They stood facing each other, 2 men, one handsome and intelligent, convinced that the strong must rule, the other in an ill-fitting tunic, holding a tablet in his hands, convinced that counting people by name was the very essence of power. Victor spoke first. He said that Ethan was not a baron, not a king. Someone who shouldn't have been in this game at all. Ethan replied that he was a logistician, that he simply counted people. Victor looked at him for a long time. Then he asked quietly what Ethan would do if the trial ended, if there were no kings, if there were no great houses. Who would rule? Who would make decisions? Who would build? Ethan thought for a moment. Then he said that in his world, they hadn't found the perfect answer to that question either, but they'd found a workable one. People rule themselves, poorly, slowly, with mistakes, but on their own, and that's better than when the gods decide for them. Victor was silent. Then he said that Ethan would lose, that the world doesn't work that way, that people are weak and cruel and stupid, and without a strong hand, they'll destroy each other. Ethan pointed to the valley behind him, to the city, at the smoke rising from the chimneys, at the children running by the river, at the people building houses, at the green, living fields. He said that weak, cruel, and foolish people had built all this, by themselves, with their own hands, because they were asked to, not forced. Victor looked at the city, for a long time. Then he turned and walked back to the remnants of his army. He didn't attack, he didn't retreat. He led his men away, without a word. The sky above the valley trembled. The air thickened. The light changed. Yesenia's interface flashed with a message Ethan hadn't seen once in all those months. Attention, operator. Incoming message. Source, architect. A voice sounded in Ethan's head. The same voice as in the marble hall, with no source, from within. The voice said that the 23rd trial had been terminated, that none of the contenders had fulfilled the conditions, that the result had been annulled, and that one of the architects, the junior one, the one who had enrolled Ethan in the engraving, wanted to speak with him. Ethan stood in the valley's passageway, alone. Before him, a figure materialized out of thin air, short, unremarkable, human-like, but not quite, the junior architect god. He said he had created the trial 1,000 years ago as a way to select good rulers, that the system had broken down, that the same clans kept winning over and over again, that he was tired, that he had entered Ethan as a last-ditch effort, an outsider who would break the game. He hadn't expected the outsider to try to bring down the architects themselves. Ethan looked at the god. Then he pulled a cube out of his pocket. Then he opened a report from the interface, the complete one. All 23 trials, all the numbers, all the losses, all the names he'd been able to find in the Yasenya archives. He held out the report to the god. He said one thing. "This is how much your game cost. Shut down the project." The architect god looked at the report. For a long time, the figure flickered. Then he raised his head. He said he couldn't shut down the trial on his own, that the senior architects wouldn't agree, that the system had been operating for millennia, that he was just one voice. Ethan replied that one voice was a beginning, that Yasin was working, that the communications module reached every corner of the continent, that he was ready to show this ledger to every resident of Ascendria, every peasant, every soldier, every baron, and that when people saw the price, they would decide for themselves whether they needed this game. The junior god looked at Ethan, then at the valley behind him, at the city, at the people, at the smoke, the children, and the fields. Then he said quietly, "You really are a logistician." Ethan replied, "I'm just counting people." The god vanished. The sky returned to normal. Yasin's interface displayed, "The trial has been suspended. Status, under review by the Council of Architects." Not closed, suspended. But for the first time in 1,000 years, the trial had stopped. Ethan stood in the passageway and looked up at the sky. Then he turned around and walked back toward the city. On the way, he ran into Ari. She was coming toward him on the trail with a medical bag slung over her shoulder. She saw his face and stopped. She asked what had happened, and then said that the trial had been suspended. Ari was silent for a moment. Then she asked if it would be for long. Ethan answered honestly that he didn't know, that it was possible, that the elder gods might decide to continue, that perhaps it would all start over again. Ari nodded. Then she took his hand. She just took it, and they walked down the path together, in silence, toward the city, toward the people, toward the smoke from the chimneys and the children's shouts by the river. Everyone was waiting for them in the square. Mia by the wall with her sword, Daniel on the steps, Yina with the ledger pressed to her chest, Hana with a mug of beer, Emma with her lute, Hanso at the entrance to the medical wing, Sophie Melda on horseback, Old Thorn on a bench, Ray, Cal, and Maury, Tom Raines, Lena, everyone. Ethan stopped. He looked at them. Then he said there would be a lot of work tomorrow, that the grain silo needed to be expanded, that Grandma May's the roof is leaking again, that the third tower needs repairs, that he needs the quarterly report on essence consumption, that Ray needs to finally fix his shield, that Ari needs to finish the textbook, that Hana promised him a set of hinges for the new gate and he still hasn't seen them. The square was silent for a second. Then Hana said loudly that the hinges were ready and that if the Baron would deign to come to the workshop, she would personally hand them to him along with a couple of hours of happiness. The square laughed. Ari smiled. Daniel shook her head. Janae rolled her eyes. Mia stood by the wall, looking at Ethan. On her face was that very same shadow he'd seen once before. Not a smile. The promise of a smile. Ethan stood in the square of the city he had built. Not with a sword, with knowledge. Not with an army, with people. Standing around him were those who had stayed, not because they had to, because they had chosen to. Dawn was breaking over the city. The first dawn after the end of the trial. And in that dawn, not a single village was burning.